believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Very good afternoon. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Monday afternoon, Gary Lineker wins his match of the day after the battle with the BBC goes into extra time. But has the corporation now scored an own goal? It's to start an independent review of its social media guidelines, but Beeb insiders say will resolve nothing. We'll have the latest live from New Broadcasting House. The biggest walkout by doctors in the history of the NHS has started, with their union, the BMA, saying some are being paid less than coffee baristas at Pret. So, what price life-saving treatment at our hospitals? And can the medics swallow the bitter taste of just £14 an hour? And they swapped the red carpet for a new champagne-coloured carpet at the Oscars, but not much fizz for the UK's film industry, seeing its lowest tally since 2017. Even Elvis was returned to sender, as Everything Everywhere seemed to win, well, almost everything. What do you think of everything that's going on? Get in touch at gbviews@gbnews.uk. Before that, latest news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you very much, and good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 12. TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and said the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. Earlier, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the spotlight really needs to be on the chairman.
I think Richard Sharp's position is increasingly untenable. Obviously, there's a process going on, but I think most people watching the complete mess of the last few days would say, how on earth is he still in position? And Gary Lineker has been taken off air. This is a mess of the BBC's own making.
Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg has questioned the validity of the BBC's licence fee.
We are all in favour of freedom of speech and people being allowed to say things that we don't agree with or we may even find offensive, and that's absolutely fine. He can say what he likes. The issue is that the BBC is the state broadcaster and that it's funded by a tax on televisions. If it weren't, then we wouldn't need to worry about its impartiality. And actually, if we changed the funding mechanism of the BBC, we could have a much freer media.
The Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt says the government had worked urgently to look after the tech sector. More than 200 companies were facing risks to cash flow before the intervention, with around £2.5 billion in capital locked in the lender.
All those really important companies that had deposits with Silicon Valley Bank UK can access their deposits, can access normal banking services as of this morning. It's a very important outcome. No taxpayers' money has been used, and I think it's a result of a lot of hard work. But I also think it shows that the UK has great resilience in its financial system, that we're able to step in with one of our biggest UK banks in a situation like this and protect a very important sector.
Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Jonathan Ashworth told GB News the sale has helped the whole country.
It's important that we've seen this arrangement this morning. I mean, a lot of our tech sector, our life sciences sector would have been severely impacted. I've actually had constituents get in touch with me who would have been impacted as well. So, look, obviously everybody will want to look at the details very carefully today, but this does seem like it has been an important intervention for what would have been something which would have had serious economic consequences for many jobs and businesses in the UK.
The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. It was signed by the three nations in 2021 to boost defences and counter China's threat in the Indo-Pacific region. Junior doctors are mounting picket lines outside hospitals for 3 days of industrial action. The British Medical Association says junior doctors in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, which it says is less than a barista in a coffee shop. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called it incredibly disappointing. The union has declined to discuss pay on the condition strikes are paused. Ballots have now opened to find Nicola Sturgeon's replacement as Scotland's new First Minister. Tens of thousands of SNP members will now have 2 weeks to vote for their next party leader. 3 candidates are in the running, with Kate Forbes, Humza Yousaf and Ash Regan all standing. Miss Sturgeon quit last month after more than 8 years in the role. Britain set to be hit by a further wintry blast today, with 51 flood alerts in place across the UK. The Met Office has issued a yellow warning for strong winds across parts of England and Wales, with gusts of up to 65 miles per hour forecast, as well as travel disruption. Whilst in Scotland, yellow warnings for snow and ice are in place until tomorrow morning, where temperatures have plunged to -8 degrees over the weekend. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Now, results just in. Gary Lineker to return to those TV screens as a BBC presenter this weekend after reaching that deal with the broadcaster. Director General Tim Davie acknowledging that the current guidance contained, quote, grey areas, saying that enforcing impartiality was a difficult balancing act. But, of course, he was the man in charge when those very guidelines were introduced back in 2020. But we're told the BBC will also now begin an independent review of its social media guidelines. But former BBC insiders, who we'll be speaking to in a moment, say that's unlikely to resolve anything, with the report being delivered to the BBC board. That's chaired, of course, by Richard Sharp. And Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has now added his voice to those calling for that chairman to step down. Well, let's get the very latest with our national reporter Ellie Costello, who's outside New Broadcasting House. And Ellie, we reflect that Gary Lineker describing these past days as surreal, perhaps the best commentary he's had for quite a time, really, on various events on and off the pitch.
Yes, good afternoon to you, Mark. Gary Lineker says he is delighted to be returning to Match of the Day this Saturday. He will be returning to our screens after a very difficult weekend for the BBC. Their sports coverage almost unrecognisable. Perhaps one of the reasons why we've seen them move so very quickly to get Gary Lineker reinstated, ready for this weekend. We've had a statement from Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, who says that Gary is a valued member of the BBC and he knows how much the BBC means to Gary, and he says he's very much looking forward to him being a part of their presenting coverage again this weekend. He did also announce that the BBC has launched an independent review into its social media policy with a particular focus on freelancers who do not work in news and current affairs. So, of course, that is somebody like Gary Lineker. This will be led by an independent body, and Tim Davie even went on to say that he recognises that there are grey areas in the current social media policy, so those do need to be addressed. In the meantime, he said that Gary Lineker has agreed to abide by the current social media policy until that independent review takes place. But Gary Lineker hasn't confirmed that he is sticking to the social media policy so far. He's been busy tweeting on his personal Twitter page in the past few hours or so. I'll just share those tweets with you now. He says, after a surreal few days, I'm delighted to have navigated a way through this. I want to thank my colleagues at BBC Sport for their remarkable show of solidarity. Football is a team game and their backing was overwhelming. He says he can't wait to get back in the Match of the Day chair on Saturday. But he goes on to go on to a final thought, which he says, however difficult the past few days have been, it simply doesn't compare to having to flee your home from persecution or war to seek refuge in a land far away. It's heartwarming to have seen the empathy towards their plight from so many of you. And his fourth and final tweet says, we remain a country of predominantly tolerant, welcoming and generous people. Thank you. So very interesting that Gary Lineker took the opportunity almost immediately to double down on his comments that he made last Tuesday. Those comments that snowballed into this row about freedom of expression and about impartiality at the BBC. But he does stand firm by those comments and he will not be apologising for them. He made that quite clear in these tweets. And he does also thank Tim Davie for his understanding and what he says is a very difficult period. So it does look as though it's been a very respectable agreement between the BBC and Gary Lineker, and perhaps changes ahead for BBC freelancers and the way that they approach social media. But for the time being, Gary Lineker will continue to tweet, at least it seems that way.
Yeah, and therefore lies that interesting question about abiding by editorial guidelines until this review is complete. I mean, have we any indication how long that process will take?
Well, this is going to be undertaken by an independent body. You can't imagine that this will be a quick process. Tim Davie was Director General in 2020, and when he became Director General, he made it clear that impartiality was going to be the focus of his leadership. Many people have been drawing attention to Richard Sharp still being in position as chairman of the BBC. He is head of the board in which this independent review will be delivered to. Many people saying it's untenable that he stays in his position. Sir Keir Starmer being the latest person calling for Richard Sharp to stand down. That's his supposed involvement in the facilitation of a loan of £800,000 to the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. That is something that Richard Sharp has denied, and I should say that investigation is still continuing. But there will be fresh calls now for Richard Sharp to resign, and with the board today saying that impartiality is the cornerstone of the BBC, I think there will be more eyes looking towards Richard Sharp, many saying his position is untenable.
Indeed. Ellie, thank you for that update at New Broadcasting House. But now let's speak to former BBC presenter, broadcasting executive Roger Bolton, now hosting the Beeb Watch podcast. Roger, good to speak to you. Thanks very much indeed. So everyone thinking maybe this was a final score, a score-all draw maybe, but you think that it might go into extra time on this issue of the independent review, what it says and who it reports to, most importantly?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure it's a score draw. I mean, I would have expected Gary Lineker to have agreed not to tweet on this, anyway, controversial subject while the review is taking place. Now, he has clearly not done that. And his latest tweets, artful, as always, effectively restate his position, but not in quite as, what she would say, extreme terms. So I think this is essentially the BBC recognising it has to get out of a hole it's in very quickly. It's a fudge. It's bought time. But how long? We don't know. So much we don't know. What are the terms of reference of this inquiry? Who's going to conduct it? When they report, to whom are they going to report? And are we going to have the BBC board? I presume it'll have to be the BBC board, which makes the final decision on what these new guidelines are. And they're chaired by somebody who will not be regarded as impartial and will not be trusted. Rightly or wrongly, Richard Sharp, because of his connections with Boris Johnson, because of the fact that he's been investigated for that relationship and what he revealed about it, and because he was almost totally absent, well, not almost, he was totally absent this weekend when the DG needed some help. He didn't step up, he didn't talk about impartiality, probably because he knew the second question people like you would put to him was, can we talk about your links to Boris Johnson?
Yeah,
So,
can we just...
the answer, they bought time, that's all.
Let's explain to people maybe. Obviously, Tim Davie is Director General, Richard Sharp the Chairman of the board as such, and therefore the BBC saying, look, Richard Sharp doesn't have any direct involvement in editorial decisions and the day-to-day running of the BBC. But what you're saying is that this report could actually pull him into that orbit, if you like, because it is the board then has to look at changing these guidelines.
Absolutely. I mean, be very clear, ultimate power at the BBC is there with the board and with the chair, and the chair can fire the Director General. The Director General can't fire the chair.
Yeah.
And whereas on day-to-day editorial decisions are delegated to the Director General, on general principles of how they behave, and this is one of them, the board will take the decision. They'll act on the recommendations of the Director General, but the board will take the decision, as they should do. So the idea that Richard Sharp is not involved in this is bonkers, frankly.
OK, and can we just return then to the role of Tim Davie himself? And clearly Gary Lineker has thanked him for his understanding during this difficult period. I mean, Tim Davie was saying the potential confusion caused by the grey areas of the BBC's social media guidance introduced in 2020 is recognised. Of course, he was the Director General in 2020 when this was introduced. So, I mean, should he be now considering his position?
No. I mean, he's a very good Director General operating in very difficult circumstances. He's having to supervise 30% and more cuts in BBC output. He's going to be desperately unpopular as a result of that, and that's not his fault. I mean, his fault may be that he tries to do everything and tries to do too much. And the other thing is that I don't think people understand there are three areas here. There's no grey area of impartiality when it comes to BBC staff or contributors who are doing news and current affairs programmes. I think there's no grey area for people who are occasional freelancers and who do odd series. They should be able to express their opinions whatever they like. But it's this grey area is the middle of somebody like Gary Lineker, who is technically a freelance, works for other people as well, but is the best paid presenter in the BBC, is regarded as the face of the BBC, and starts to make controversial statements about an issue which will run and run to the next election. And, there is a real problem here. But what I'm delighted about is the fact that we should all be in this discussion about what impartiality is. And the BBC ought to belong to us. We pay for it. So we should have a say in what we think is legitimate. I think, however, Gary ought to think very hard about whether or not he should continue to tweet in a controversial way, given the damage this does cause to the BBC and does cause to the whole argument for impartiality is that if you have an impartiality broadcast like the BBC, they can have plenty of other organisations like yours which properly reflect different opinions. But you want someone at the heart of that. where opinions aren't being expressed and they're just trying to establish the facts on which debate should take place.
Yeah, and maybe it's informed debate when you start introducing aspects, of course, about Nazi Germany. However, that's a different point. But, Roger, thank you very much.
He didn't say Nazi Germany. He said Germany in the 1930s.
Germany 1930s.
Which was silly of him, but he didn't actually use the word Nazis.
Okay, fair point. Accuracy as ever as a journalist. Roger, thank you for your time. Good to speak to you again. No doubt I think we'll be speaking to you again in the days to come. But let's now bring in former head of religion and ethics at the BBC and Channel 4, indeed, Akhil Ahmed, who joins us. Thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you were able to hear what Roger was reflecting, though, in terms of this independent review. What are your thoughts on this going forward now?
Well, obviously speaking on a personal capacity here, I think that I think it was inevitable. I think there was no way out for the BBC in particular. I think I actually welcome this, actually. I think we do need to have it. Just as Roger said, there is this grey area. There's no grey area for news and current affairs presenters, full stop, although there are some news and current affairs presenters who have been able to tweet some significant things, quite frankly, and that I would say actually bring them into disrepute with regards to the BBC guidelines. But with regards to the Gary Linekers of this world, and there are others as well, I think it's just very difficult to police what somebody does when working for the BBC is not their full-time job. And we can have conversations about they may be the highest paid earner, etc. But that's not necessarily the most relevant conversation. How many days a week do they work for the BBC? How many days a week do they work for other people? That actually means this is the way we are going forward. So I welcome this review. I would be interested to know who's going to be on the review. Is it going to be some of the usual suspects? Is it going to be people that, who's going to be picking and who, and in terms of diversity, not just cultural diversity, but diversity of thinking, that kind of stuff. I think it'd be really interesting to get to the bottom of what they're going to be doing.
Yeah, and political stance as well, of course, which is the key.
Exactly, that's that diversity of thought,
Yeah. What's your reaction to what Roger was saying, that this may well turn up going onto the desk of the BBC board and therefore the chairman, Richard Sharp, and of course the position he's been put in with Sir Keir Starmer, the latest voice suggesting he should be stepping down?
Well, I'm not going to comment on whether or not he should step down or not. What I would say is that actually I agree. I understand where Roger's coming from, because actually I think it's very hard to argue that he was missing this weekend. And I know, as a former senior exec at the BBC, the chairman, they step in, they help, they advise. The DG shouldn't be doing this on their own. And I think actually he couldn't step in because the fact of the matter is there are so many serious issues to be answered about impartiality with regards to his appointment and actually his political allegiances, etc. Right. Now, I think that's the key thing that has to be looked at as well with regards to the whatever kind of independent panel gets put in. Okay. Actually, the belief system of individuals working or associated with the BBC as well.
Last thought, what about Tim Davie himself? Because he's reflecting, as I put to Roger, about the potential confusion caused by the grey areas of the social media guidance. He was the Director General in 2020 when these were put in place. I mean, surely they should have sorted it out then.
Well, the BBC is very good at fudging, and it's very good at kind of like kicking the ball into the long grass, etc. Look, I think things have moved on radically and moved on, and they're going to move on even more. And I think, what, I'm not going to blame Tim. I'm not going to blame any of those former executives. What I will say is make sure that the people who discuss this going forward have a diversity of thought and are truly independent.
Akhil Ahmed, thank you very much for your view. And, of course, we'll see what happens with that review as and when it takes place. Thank you very much indeed. Well, coming up elsewhere, of course, the doctors are walking out, the biggest walkout by doctors in the history of the NHS. Their union, the BMA, saying some are being paid less than coffee baristas. Is that a price worth paying? We'll take a break. Back shortly.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not
believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank. My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Now, let's update you with the fact that the longest ever period of industrial action by junior doctors has begun, lasting for 72 hours. Members of the British Medical Association have already formed picket lines outside the hospitals in their protests over conditions and pay. They say it's a direct threat to patients' lives and that they've lost some 26% in pay cuts in real terms in the last 15 years. Let's get the picture at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital with our South West of England reporter, Jeff Moody. And Jeff, clearly the doctors are angry in their view that some of the junior members are being paid less than coffee baristas, they're saying.
Well, absolutely. I mean, 35% as a pay rise does sound pretty substantial, doesn't it? But they say that because of inflation, they're actually paid around the same as they were in 2008. So they're saying that really that their pay has been cut by 26% since 2008. Well, junior doctors make up 40% of the NHS workforce. So this is a really significant strike today. This is the worst strike, they're saying, in NHS history. Well, the organisers of the strike have been speaking this morning. Professor Banfield is the chair of the British Medical Association. He said in the last few minutes, he says, we've had the worst crisis in the NHS that I've ever known, and it's seeing junior doctors leave in their drones. He's also saying that the government has refused to listen, and he's saying that people have been forced to take this action. He says no one wants to strike, but strike action has to be effective. What's going on day in, day out is that patients are dying, he says. Well, the opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has gone on record this morning to say the way to resolve strikes is to get around the table and to negotiate and compromise and come to a settlement. The government says that that's exactly what they've done. They've suggested that junior doctors sit round the table with them to discuss things, but the British Medical Association has refused to participate in discussions at the moment because, in their words, the discussions would only take place if the strike was called off in advance, and they want to hold the strike strike action as their key playing card, if you like, whilst those negotiations take place. So we've got 72 hours of walkouts now. The NHS is saying if you have an appointment at a hospital, do still turn up to that hospital for that appointment unless you've been told otherwise. But many, many thousands have been told otherwise today.
And clearly the worry for many patients is what cover will be provided. I don't know what they're saying there at that particular hospital, but I know Professor Stephen Powers, who's the medical director of NHS Cancer Care, is saying, you know, many cancer appointments will be affected directly.
Yes, but of course what their argument is that cancer appointments have been affected anyway, that this is not something new. It's not the case that people are suddenly being affected. Those problems have been running for a number of years now as the services have been increasingly strapped for cash. That's in the words of the British Medical Association. But yes, we are hearing that many appointments have been cancelled, which is really just not what the NHS needs at the moment when they're still coping with a massive backlog from the COVID days.
Yeah. OK, Jeff, thank you very much for updating us there with the situation down in Devon. But let's now speak to NHS doctor Raj Arora, who's a junior doctor doing training, of course, as many are, and then has ended up with a GP's position. Dr. Arora, what's the position there at the front line that you're experiencing? Because clearly, perhaps much like the nurses, not just about pay, but conditions too.
Absolutely. I think what we're experiencing is a lot of anger, really, that, you know, during the time that we had COVID and hospitals were pressurised, there was a lot of clapping and sort of motivational uplifting of doctors and NHS staff. But actually what we really need are changes in, you know, on the ground of what is happening with junior doctors and with other NHS staff as well. So I think there's anger and there's a real sort of desperation to sort of fight our cause now and say that, you know, we don't want to continue this way. You know, there is a mass exodus of junior doctors. It's quite worrying to see them moving into different career paths or not being able to keep up their financial needs and therefore being forced to leave as well. So there's a lot going on. I think that's the reason why junior doctors are taking strike action. Obviously, I'm not a junior doctor right now, but I have been one. And I completely understand where they're coming from. It's a very difficult, challenging environment. You feel isolated, you feel stressed, you want the best for your patient. Let's get real. You don't come into medicine and become a doctor because you want to make millions, right? You do something different if you wanted to do that. So you do it because you want to make sure there's good patient care, good staff welfare, and you're providing a service. And like the gentleman just said,
yeah, and obviously many of our GPs go through this process of being a junior doctor at hospital. It's your rite of passage, if you like. But what do you make about these reports from the BMA that many of these junior doctors now are on £14 an hour, effectively, which is less than you'd get as a barista at Pret-a-Manger?
I think it's sad. I mean, we're not here to devalue the work of a barista at Pret or wherever it may be, but I think it's important to recognise that doctors are skilled professionals. You know, you go through 6 years of training, and most junior doctors will leave with thousands of pounds of debt, you know, and then you go into this £14 an hour. And at that time, you are the most junior person in the rankings of the doctors, and you're going to be doing the on-calls, the extra hours. And as a junior, I certainly did numerous unpaid hours. You know, I spent a lot of time in the hospital. So there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of challenges you're already experiencing. On top of that, if you're not able to pay your bills or pay the debt, you know, it can be quite stressful, and it can be quite a burnout mentally for lots of junior doctors as well.
And this is exactly what we were hearing, of course, from the nurses a few weeks ago. So is it the fact that the government has to reassess how the NHS is actually manned or actually how people are put in positions in terms of working all these extra hours, the positions of stress? Because as you and the nurses say, that has a direct consequence for patient care.
It absolutely does. And actually, not just patient care, but staff welfare. You can't pour from an empty cup, you know. I experienced serious physical illness during my time as a junior doctor as a direct side effect of working ridiculous hours and not putting myself forward, you know. So I think not putting myself first, not taking the time out, not knowing when to say no. When you're put onto extra shifts and you're asked to pull in and do those hours, it's not really a choice. You know, you're worried of your reputation, that they might think of you as a troublemaker or you're not serious about your career. So actually there's a lot going on. And I think, yes, sadly, I mean, we love the NHS, you know, what it stands for. It's for us, it's for the public. But I think what we have to start to really think about is, can we maintain it how it is now? And I don't think we can. We have to start to think about how we can make those changes, how we can value those junior doctors, because junior doctor means entrance from medical school all the way till exit. So when you're exiting as a GP or you're exiting as a consultant, you are still a junior doctor. You're skilled, you're experienced, you're saving lives, you're running on calls, but you're still junior. And if you're not going to appreciate those people, they're going to leave.
Indeed, a simple fact of life. Well, Dr. Raj Arora, I know you'll have patients waiting in the waiting room there. We'll let you get on to address their concerns, but thank you very much indeed for bringing us your tale and story here on GB News. And, of course, we'll reflect on the various picket lines throughout the afternoon as well. Also coming up, we're reflecting on the situation in the Falkland Islands. Yes, Argentina ripping up a key cooperation agreement. What could that mean? We'll be assessing that shortly. First, an update on the bulletins with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Here are the headlines at 12:34. TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and said the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. The Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of the collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC for a nominal sum of £1. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt says the government worked urgently to look after the tech sector, confirming all customer deposits would be protected with no cost to the taxpayer. The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met with his Australian counterpart in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with the US President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. It was signed by the three nations in 2021 to boost defences and counter China's threat in the Indo-Pacific region. Junior doctors are staging 3 days of industrial action. The British Medical Association says junior doctors in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, which is less than a barista in a coffee shop. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called it incredibly disappointing. The union has declined to discuss pay on the condition strikes are paused. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts of
Moss?
women's- Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, Argentina is being accused of placing the Falklands in an economic stranglehold. It's ripped up a key cooperation agreement and demanded fresh talks on the island's sovereignty. Well, this comes as islanders mark the 10th anniversary of their referendum vote to remain British. Our Home and Security Editor Mark White has the latest.
Across the Falklands, they're marking a decade since they voted by a staggering 99.8% to remain British. Although overseen by international observers, the results of that referendum have never been recognised by the Argentinian government. 7 years ago, Buenos Aires and London effectively agreed to disagree over the island's sovereignty and signed up to a pact aimed at improving economic, environmental and social relations. But this week, all that ended as the Argentinians ripped up the agreement and demanded fresh talks over the future of the Falklands.
We're always disappointed with the reaction from Argentina, but we're not at all surprised. It's something that we've come to live with, and we understand them very, very clearly. When the economy and when the political situation in Argentina gets tough, then we are the sort of whipping boys from their point of view.
The Argentinian economy is in meltdown. Critics of the government in Buenos Aires accuse it of reigniting the row over Falkland sovereignty to distract from its domestic troubles. On a practical level, though, any withdrawal from the cooperation agreement will hurt the islands.
It has impacted the Falklands because we can't share fisheries data with Argentina because of the migration of the fish stock in the ocean. We've lost a flight to Sao Paulo, which was our second link to South America. And also the agreement benefited Argentina because it helped identify the war dead from the war. So I don't really think anyone comes out better for this agreement coming to an end.
With more than 1,000 British military personnel, Typhoon fighters and a Royal Navy presence, the Falklands is far better defended now than before the war in '82. No one here believes Argentina has the slightest interest or indeed capability to threaten the islands militarily. But for the time being at least, it seems determined to ramp up the diplomatic and economic pressure despite the expressed wish of this island community. Mark White, GB News.
Well, let's get the very latest from Mark joining us in the studio. And Mark, could be some concerns, of course, people remembering the warning signs that some say were ignored back in 1982 before the war broke out. I mean, is Argentina becoming that belligerent again?
Well, it has become fairly belligerent at regular intervals, and really it's often coincided with a downturn in the economy. You know, they're looking to distract, and the Malvinas is always a popular issue to get the base back home in Argentina whipped up, absolutely. We know that Galtieri did that leading up to the war in '82. I mean, no one at all anticipates that it could deteriorate to the possibility of some kind of military intervention. Argentina these days is just not capable of doing that in terms of its own military. It's slowly starting to try and build up its military with the assistance of some other countries, but it has, you know, a fairly sort of military capability that's somewhat lacking compared to what it was in '82.
Could still cause problems, I guess, in terms of fishing rights, oil exploration, because obviously a lot of people have pointed out, you know, quite lucrative areas in the sea for both. But, I mean, one also reflects perhaps we would not be capable of launching a task force, given what's happened in terms of defence cuts, many analysts say.
Well, the slight difference this time is that actually we are much better placed on the islands itself in terms of the military capabilities. There's a squadron of Typhoon fighters there, transport and refuelling aircraft. There's also, you know, military personnel, about 1,000 odd. There's a Royal Naval permanent presence there as well. So in that sense, it's much better equipped to be able to fend off any incursion or attempted incursion until more reinforcements arrive from the UK. But you're right, on the economic front, this can do, you know, a lot of harm to the islands. It was effectively after that referendum 10 years ago, in which a staggering 99.8% of the population, perhaps unsurprisingly, said that they wanted to stay British, that the Argentina and the UK agreed to disagree over sovereignty, but then introduced this pact, pact of cooperation to try to, you know, boost economic ties, scientific ties as well, of course.
And Buenos
around
Aires
fishing.
have literally ripped that up. They said, no, that no longer applies.
Absolutely. It's been ripped up now. So what that will mean going forward, we're just not sure. Whether they will look to, you know, trying to reinstigate some kind of deal at a later date, I don't know. But they are feeling the effects, flights being cancelled, that kind of thing.
I mean, could one of the ways out be that they hold another referendum 10 years on with a likely return result of that, and that sends a message to the world, no, these islands want to stay British?
Well, we might think so. I think the government in Buenos Aires are not in the slightest bit interested in referendums. They did not at all accept the conclusion, the return from the previous referendum a decade ago. So
even though they surrendered on the 14th of June 1982, we remember 255 British personnel, 3 Falkland Islanders, of course, who died in that. Mark, thank you very much indeed for that. But let's move on now to other matters with lots of banking deals being done this morning, and indeed lots of transatlantic phone calls over the weekend. The result being HSBC has bought the UK arm of the Silicon Valley Bank. That's a private sale involving the government of Bank of England, but no taxpayers' money. Well, the UK branch was in insolvency last night, or US branch, after Silicon Valley's California-based parent company had assets seized by the US regulators on Friday. Our business and economics editor Liam Halligan joining us to explain more with On the Money. So, UK good, US bad? Is that the way that we look at it at the moment?
You could characterise it like that, but I think in general it's good for everybody that on both sides of the Atlantic the authorities have guaranteed the deposits held at both the US head company and the UK subsidiary of Silicon Valley Bank. If this deal hadn't have been done with HSBC, the biggest bank in Europe, a British-originated bank, of course, buying the UK subsidiary of Silicon Valley Bank, then we would be talking about nothing else, because financial markets would be in free fall.
And there'd be a run on banks.
Already, as there'll be people queuing up outside banks, as there was in 2008. The dent to confidence could not be undone. We would have had financial turmoil for weeks and weeks and weeks, dominating everything. Now, as it happens, Mark, it is still pretty shaky on financial markets. When I last looked, the FTSE 100, that's the main index of shares in the UK, was down 4%, which is a very chunky fall in one day. Some of the banking stocks were down by
one area, the banking
by even
stocks.
more. Yeah, but the whole of the index was down 4% because there are contagion effects. I personally think, based on the information we now have, that turmoil will be contained. I personally think that we will get through this. But be in no doubt, if this deal hadn't have been done, and we're told it doesn't use any government money, let's see what future historians say about that, because there's different ways of government support. There can be letters of comfort, there can be implicit guarantees. We know HSBC bought this UK subsidiary of this US bank for £1. So obviously they were taking on lots and lots of debt. But we have to say, on balance, it's a good thing that this deal has been done.
And we understand some $7 billion in deposits, 3,000 British companies with their money in this bank. Because this was the other thing. If it had gone down, then it's all the money that all these start-up companies and tech companies in Britain would have literally
and they employ lots of people. Where's their cash gone? It's been vaporised because this bank has failed. We think the bank failed. Again, the details are sketchy, but we think the bank failed because it was investing the deposits it was getting in certain kinds of financial instruments, and particularly bonds, and as interest rates rose around the world, the price of those bonds fell, so the value of their portfolio fell. But look, this is a kind of shot across the bows of the global financial system, and I personally think that in Wednesday's budget, Jeremy Hunt, who's under a lot of pressure to cut taxes, spend more money from his own backbenchers, he can now point to his own backbenchers and say, look, behave yourselves. The reason I'm not doing anything risky, the reason I'm not cutting taxes is because the financial system is shaky. Look at Silicon Valley Bank.
And let's talk now about banking regulation, both sides of the pond, because clearly we know now that Andrew Bailey, Bank of England, and Jeremy Hunt were on the phones to actually get this deal sorted. And it was in place, ready for business this morning. So the system has worked. However, questions perhaps the other side in terms of the US Federal Reserve and what's been happening. I'm just reading here, Goldman Sachs, big US bank, predicting the Fed will pause its rate rises later this month because of the stress in the banking system. That indicates perhaps how many stresses and strains there are in America.
Well, of course, Silicon Valley Bank has much more going on in the US than it does in the UK. It's a much bigger problem in the US. But the US authorities have issued a statement saying that deposits will be guaranteed for those who've put money into Silicon Valley Bank in the States as well. And who knows, Goldman Sachs, they're an investment bank. They say a lot of things that don't come true. We just don't report it when the stuff they say doesn't come true, frankly. They don't have a particularly impressive forecasting record, by the way. Over many years.
We were thinking the Fed was going to push rates a bit harder.
Even though the media are obsessed with them. But yes, of course, when there's systemic problems in the system, when financial markets are looking shaky, any central bank will think, is this really the time to keep pushing up interest rates? I do think the Fed will raise interest rates because it's absolutely determined to squeeze inflation finally out of the system. Inflation in the US, it's been 5, 6, 7% in recent months rather than 10 and 11% as it is here. So the US is further down the track of taming inflation, but it may be that rather than a 50 basis point, 0.5% increase, they go for 0.25% instead.
Yeah, and sort of raise step by step. So just to come back to the point about Wednesday now with the budget, will this have Jeremy Hunt reassessing in any way? The point was put to him at the weekend, you're like Jeremy from accounts, Mr. Cautious. Is he going to be even more cautious?
As I said earlier, I think he can use this financial shakiness, this scare, this dodged bullet, if you like, as to his political advantage, because he is a kind of Treasury guy. He is a lot more likely to do the orthodox thing than, say, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, to conjure with two names at random. Of course, they were the authors of the mini budget, which did coincide.
Maxi impact.
Did coincide with a lot of financial turbulence. There's a lot of reason for that financial turbulence, but that's another discussion, whether or not it was entirely or even mostly the mini budget. We can talk about that another time. But Jeremy Hunt does want to do the orthodox thing. He doesn't want to reverse the increase in corporation tax. He doesn't want to unfreeze the tax thresholds, which will drag more and more of us into the top rate of tax. Over the next 4 years, Mark, the number of people paying top rate of tax in this country, as things stand with the thresholds frozen until 2028, about 50 grand, will go from 4 to 8 million people. That's an incredibly anti-aspirational move, a lot of voters would say.
Middle earners suddenly become high earners.
You know,
with no
people in middle management, not particularly senior teachers, not particularly senior policemen and women, suddenly they're paying tax at the top rate. That was not meant to happen. So I suggest, and I've been saying it since we first learnt about the Silicon Valley Bank at the start of the weekend, the problems there, that I think Jeremy Hunt will use this to his advantage. He'll highlight the fact that he has been the author of a stabilisation programme, which we learnt about this morning, and he'll say, and this is the reason why I'm not taking any risks, so you Tory backbenchers who are criticising me, you just pipe down.
And we're going to be on air at 11 o'clock on Wednesday.
We certainly are.
And running through the... runners and riders.
Indeed.
Yeah. We shall see what awaits us, good or bad or indifferent. Liam, for the moment, thank you. But let's move on to the Oscars now, because the UK's film industry saw its lowest tally of wins since 2017. The most notable winner, Michelle Yeoh, who won Best Actress for Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, as the film seemed to have done, and in the process becoming the first Asian woman to receive the award. The film itself coming out on top, 7 awards. Best Actor going to Brendan Fraser for his appearance in The Whale. Well, let's speak now to showbiz journalist Rebecca Toomey, who's joining us. Rebecca, thanks very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, especially if you've been up overnight watching all the action and listening in to see what happened on the champagne carpet, we're told. It's not a red carpet. They changed that as well.
Yes, I think this is really just a ploy to do something different and create some attention on the Oscars, and not what happened last year with the infamous Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. So the most exciting thing they wanted to happen was that they changed the red carpet to a champagne goldy hue that everyone was walking, but really nothing massively changed. It's just a lot of lovies patting themselves on the back. But it was wonderful to see Everything Everywhere All at Once scoop 7 Oscars. That's a phenomenal amount, and also a very brilliant film. And how fantastic to see a 60-year-old actress grabbing the Best Actress award. I think that's what everyone was talking about at the moment. But yes, the Banshees of Inisherin, which won very big at the BAFTAs, did get sidelined last night, which is a real shame. And also people were surprised that Cate Blanchett, who was in Tar, she didn't pick up the Best Actor gong. And my personal favourite, Top Gun Maverick, that didn't really get a look in either.
And Elvis as well didn't really get much of a look in, despite many people. So was it one of these years when, commercial success at the box office perhaps ruled you out for the artistic award as such?
Well, I don't really think box office success ever really tallies with these awards. You never see things like, the original Jurassic Park really doing that well. It's always very arty. Sometimes, often I find quite depressing films that the critics seem to love. The more sort of difficult it is, if someone shaves their head for a role, they get the Oscar rather than them just having a really good part. So I think really what people find popular is sometimes a bit snobby in the arts, particularly with the Oscars and with Hollywood, because obviously the Academy Awards are the highest caliber of acting and film awards you can get. So they want to make sure that, the lovies that are a part of all these panels and do all the voting, they want to make sure that something truly artistic comes about and not just something the public loves, which is a shame, because if it were a public vote, I'm not sure we'd see the same result. It's really sort of an opportunity for Hollywood's elite to have their moment, to do their speeches. In previous ceremonies, people like Ricky Gervais has told them at the Golden Globes not to use it as a platform to air their political views. It should just be stuck to, the celebrity sphere and to talking about films.
And talking about the Hollywood elite, Steven Spielberg with a very highly regarded film about the Fabelmans didn't get a look in either.
I think maybe I did roll my eyes when I saw that he'd been nominated, because of course Spielberg is a fantastic director with a brilliant career. But I think it's just, he's very predictable that he would be nominated, and perhaps he's a victim of actually, you know, there's a very big drive for diversity, and I think rightly so, particularly in this very elite world. But sometimes perhaps the agenda for diversity might just overshadow some really true talent, because I think now all these award ceremonies have to make sure they're being fair, have to make sure enough people are nominated. We saw it with the BAFTAs. They were saying not enough female directors were nominated, but were there enough good films that females had directors that were worthy of that spot?
Good point.
And that's a much bigger debate.
Indeed. Rebecca, thank you very much indeed for bringing us your assessment and, of course, congratulations to all those and commiserations to those who didn't. Thank you very much. Coming up here on GB News, the biggest walkout by doctors in the history of the NHS. How is it going to hit you? We'll be finding out.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not
believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one.
Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Monday lunchtime, the biggest walkout by doctors in the history of the NHS now underway. Their union, the BMA, says some are now being paid less than coffee baristas at Pret. So what price life-saving treatment at our hospitals should the medics have to swallow the bitter taste of £14 an hour? Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announcing £5 billion extra in defence spending over the next 2 years. The PM now in the US to sign a major defence deal with President Joe Biden and the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Is it the sign of a growing prospect of a global Cold War? While Argentina is accused of placing the Falklands in an economic stranglehold after it ripped up a key cooperation agreement demanding fresh talks on the island's sovereignty. What do you think of everything that's going on in the world? Get in touch with us at gbviews at gbnews.uk. Before that, latest headlines coming up with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you, and good afternoon from the GB Newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 1. Well, let's just start the bulletin with some breaking news for you this hour. And a major incident has been declared in Swansea after a suspected gas explosion in the Morriston area. The leader of the local council, Rob Stewart, says emergency services are on site responding to the incident. It's not yet known whether there are any injuries. That's all we have at the moment. A major incident's been declared in Swansea after a suspected gas explosion in the Morriston area. We will, of course, bring you more on this story as we get it. TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and said the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. Earlier, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the spotlight really needs to be on the chairman.
I think Richard Sharp's position is increasingly untenable. Obviously, there's a process going on. But I think most people watching the complete mess of the last few days would say, how on earth is he still in position? And Gary Lineker has been taken off air. This is a mess of the BBC's own making.
Well, Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg has questioned the validity of the BBC's licence fee.
We are all in favour of freedom of speech and people being allowed to say things that we don't agree with or we may even find offensive, and that's absolutely fine. He can say what he likes. The issue is that the BBC is the state broadcaster and that it's funded by a tax on televisions. If it weren't, then we wouldn't need to worry about its impartiality. And actually, if we changed the funding mechanism of the BBC, we could have a much freer media.
The Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt says the government had worked urgently to look after the tech sector. More than 200 companies were facing risks to cash flow before the intervention, with around £2.5 billion in capital locked in the lender.
All those really important companies that had deposits with Silicon Valley Bank UK can access their deposits, can access normal banking services as of this morning. It's a very important outcome. No taxpayers' money has been used, and I think it's a result of a lot of hard work. But I also think it shows that the UK has great resilience in its financial system, that we're able to step in with one of our biggest UK banks in a situation like this and protect a very important sector.
The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met his Australian counterpart and Anthony Albanese in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. It was signed by the three nations in 2021 to boost defences and counter China's threat in the Indo-Pacific region. Junior doctors are mounting picket lines outside hospital for 3 days of industrial action. The British Medical Association... Sorry for that. The British Medical Association says junior doctors in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, which it says is less than a barista in a coffee shop. The Health Secretary Steve Barclay says a 35% pay rise demand is unaffordable.
Working extremely hard with NHS England and with hospital bosses to mitigate the impact of the junior doctor strike. That is why it's important that we engage in meaningful and constructive talks with them. We stand ready to engage with the junior doctors on that in exactly the same way we have with other health unions. And I urge the junior doctors to come and have those discussions as the other health unions have been doing, so we can pause the strikes and discuss those issues.
Britain's set to be hit by further wintry blasts today, with 51 flood alerts in place across the UK. The Met Office has issued a yellow warning for strong winds across parts of England and Wales, with gusts of up to 65 miles per hour forecast and travel disruption expected. In Scotland, yellow warnings for snow and ice are in place until tomorrow morning, where temperatures have plunged to -8 degrees over the weekend. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's over to Mark.
Tamsin, thank you very much indeed. So, that longest ever period of industrial action by junior doctors in the NHS has started this morning and will now last for 3 days. Members of the BMA saying that the most junior members are just earning £14 less than a barista at Pret. They form picket lines outside many hospitals across the country in protest at pay and conditions they say are threatening patients' lives. Our reporter Lisa Hartle's been to speak to one junior doctor to find out more about their situation.
We're having patients having heart attacks in waiting rooms, dying in waiting rooms because there's not enough of us to see them. It doesn't get more serious. It can't get more serious than this.
Dr. Arjun Singh is one of thousands of junior doctors going on strike today for 72 hours. He says because their pay hasn't kept up with inflation, they're working for 26% less than they were 15 years ago. And that this explains why fewer doctors are entering the NHS, why more are now leaving, and patient safety is suffering.
I'm ashamed of the care that we are providing our patients. I'm absolutely ashamed. And it's the feeling of guilt only amplifies when these patients' loved ones will tell us and they'll say, I know you've tried your best and you've done everything you can. And yes, we have tried our best. And yes, we've done everything that we physically could, but there was so much more we could have done if there was more of us, if we had more resources, but we don't. And ultimately, it's these people that would have had another wedding anniversary, would have seen kids grow up, that don't. Whereas 5 years ago, they would have made all of these experiences. They don't. They're taken away. They come into an NHS hospital. It's the last thing they ever do because there's just not enough of us.
A survey by the British Medical Association found that of the 37,000 junior doctors who took part in the ballot, 98% voted for strike action. 4 in 10 junior doctors are planning to leave the NHS as soon as they can find another job. And a third of junior doctors are planning to work as doctors in another country in the next 12 months. Poor pay and working conditions were among the top reasons for junior doctors wanting to leave.
I know doctors that are learning other languages so they can practice in Europe. That's crazy. It's genuinely crazy. And it is happening right now. We want that junior doctor who's saddled with debts of £100,000, who's the first port of call for 250 patients in the middle of the night, who is running the wards at 3 in the morning to start life-saving treatment for your loved one, to get paid £19 an hour from 14. It's not a huge ask.
But what about patient safety if doctors aren't on the wards but on the picket lines?
I mean, no doctor wants to go on strike. Like I said, I've been thinking of this career since I've been about 5. Striking's never come up in my mind. We've been backed into a corner. We have no other option. It's been 15 years that we've been telling this government what's happening. And we've got a population now that is ageing. They've got increasing health requirements, and we're losing doctors every single day. We don't have enough doctors to look after patients. Patients are dying horrendous deaths with no dignity because there are not enough of us. We're not providing good care. What are we to do?
The strike action by junior doctors is planned to continue until Wednesday. The British Medical Association say senior doctors are also considering strike action in the near future. Lisa Hartle, GB News, London.
Well, in response to this strike, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, said that junior doctors' pay had increased by 8% over the past 4 years and hoped that discussions with the unions would continue. But the BMA, Dr. Robert Lawrenson, chair of the BMA Junior Doctors Committee, saying they had gone to many meetings, but Mr. Barclay had only turned up to one. Well, of course, 60,000 doctors now taking action, 100,000 operations and outpatient appointments already rescheduled this year. Let's join now Jeff Moody, our South West reporter, who's outside the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital. Jeff, what sort of picture are they giving you there about what disruption there'll be?
Well, patients here have been told that they should attend their appointments as planned. Anybody that's appointment is cancelled has already been told. It's a familiar message, isn't it, that we've been hearing over the last few weeks and months as these various strikes play out. This is the biggest strike in the NHS history. And when you think that 40% of the NHS workforce are junior doctors, you can understand why. Well, Sir Keir Starmer has waded into the row this morning by saying that it's about time the government sat down with the BMA and discussed terms in terms of pay and conditions, but the government has said that they have offered to do this already. They have asked the BMA to sit down and discuss things, but the BMA say that the government said they would only sit down and discuss pay and conditions if the strikes were called off in advance. And that's the sticking point, because the BMA are saying we're not going to call off the strikes in advance until we know the outcome of the discussions. There's also a lot of talk about pay being backdated to 2008. It's worth mentioning that the Conservative government wasn't in power in 2008, but the BMA are saying that that was when inflation started to rise exponentially and their pay packet didn't. So they say that they now need a 35% pay increase in order to make up for what they call pay decreases they've been receiving since 2008. It's an increasingly bitter dispute, Mark, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon.
Jeff, thank you very much for updating us down there at Exeter. And, of course, we'll assess the situation in these next 3 days and get the latest both from the unions and the government. Now, Rishi Sunak has insisted that the UK's armed forces have the funding they need for a more volatile world, as he said, with challenges by China and Russia growing. The Prime Minister promising an extra £5 billion for the military over the next 2 years, but failing to meet Tory demands, backbenchers' demands at least, to commit to a goal of spending 3% of the UK's GDP on defence. It's more like now 2.5%. The Prime Minister is in the United States today, meeting with President Joe Biden and the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to flesh out a major defence deal, particularly with submarines. Joining us now is Alexander Downer, former Australian Foreign Minister. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr Downer. This is the so-called AUKUS meeting, and as I said, it seems to be focusing on the issue of submarines to combat maybe the growing threat of China in the Pacific.
Yes, this is right. I mean,
Alexander, we're just getting a bit of problem on the signal with you. We'll just try and get a better line for that. But just to reiterate that we've had the Prime Minister meeting Joe Biden and Mr Albanese in San Diego in the United States to discuss that deal, particularly on a new generation of submarines to be based in Australia to combat, as we say, the growing threat from China. I think we've got a problem speaking to... Well, I think, yeah, Mr Downer, we can, get you back on the line now. Apologies for that. I think we have a better signal from you. Just coming up now. Yes, we can see you. We can hear you as well, hopefully.
I was making the point that, what we have to try to achieve is a balance of power between a rising China on the one hand and the liberal democracies, including ourselves, on the other. And AUKUS is about the UK, Australia and the United States getting together on high-end technology, including nuclear-powered submarines, and making sure that we have effective forces and capability and lethality even in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's a very welcome development.
And this would be inevitably a direct response, I suppose, to China appearing to flex its diplomatic and military muscles, particularly in that Pacific region.
Yes, I mean, there are all sorts of links here, though, and let me explain what I mean. There is China's aggression in the South China Sea and it taking over of reefs and islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them. There is China's threat to Taiwan, which is repeated time and again by Xi Jinping. But there is also China's alliance with Russia and Russia's activities, of course, above all, most recently in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the need for us to join all those dots together and make sure that countries that really have common views and a common view of the world are able to provide the balance of power to stop those authoritarian states starting to take over the world.
Now, we're being told Anthony Albanese's plane took a major detour to avoid flying over Chinese airspace, which is interesting. I mean, are we perhaps entering the era of a new global Cold War now?
Well, I don't think there's any need for that. And I mean, obviously, I very much hope there's not. There is a Cold War, and even worse with Russia at the moment, but certainly not with China. We need to balance China's power. We need to show a determination as liberal democracies to work together. The NATO countries, Japan, Australia, South Korea, all of our countries need to weld together in support of our values and make sure our defence forces become increasingly interoperable.
Yeah.
But we do have to coexist with China as well. So we have to find methods of coexistence, not just balancing power. So I don't think a new Cold War is the way to go with China.
No. Well, we speak to you as well, of course, on Commonwealth Day, King Charles's first Commonwealth Day message at Westminster Abbey. We believe the theme is forging a sustainable and peaceful common future. How apt is that?
It's very apt. We don't want an unsustainable future, otherwise the future will come to an end. So we do want something sustainable. That's a trope of the era.
Yeah.
But we do want a peaceful Commonwealth, and I just draw attention to the much greater degree of collaboration diplomatically between the largest country in the Commonwealth, India, and countries like the UK and Australia. So I think the Commonwealth is, it's just a network, the Commonwealth, but it is a network that is working pretty well at the moment. And we look forward to hearing the King at Westminster Abbey later today.
Indeed, because there had been a concern about about India moving more towards the Russian orbit at some stage.
I know India, right from independence in 1947, was somewhat in what we called then the Soviet Union's orbit.
Yeah.
And Pakistan more in the Western orbit. So you have to understand that history. But what has happened with India is in the last few years, it's substantially shifted towards the United States, the UK, Australia, because it's worried about threats to India from the rise of China. And so that's why it's collaborating with all of us better.
Right.
By the way, better than it has done at any time since 1947.
OK, well, Alexander Dunn, a great pleasure to speak to you once more, especially on this Commonwealth Day. Thanks for joining us here on GB News. And, of course, we'll have reflections on that Commonwealth ceremony. As we say, King Charles, the first Commonwealth Day message in the great pulpit in Westminster Abbey. More coming up on that a little later. But let's update you now on our match report. Gary Lineker to return to screens as a BBC presenter for the coming weekend after reaching a deal with the broadcaster. Is it a 1-1 score draw? Well, Director General Tim Davie acknowledged the current guidance contained grey areas, saying that enforcing impartiality was a difficult balancing act. Let's get more with our national reporter, Ellie Costello, who's outside New Broadcasting House for us. And Ellie, of course, we reflect that in that building behind you, there have been fairly differing opinions at the way this has been handled.
Yes, there certainly has been, Mark, but now victory for Gary Lineker, who will be returning to our screens this weekend after a deal was brokered between himself and the BBC after what was a pretty bruising weekend for the broadcaster, it must be said. There was a snap poll over the weekend where 53% of respondents to this YouGov poll said that the BBC had handled this incorrectly. They shouldn't have taken Gary Lineker off screen, so perhaps perhaps that's one of the reasons why they moved so quickly to reinstate Gary Lineker. We have a statement from the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, who says, Gary is a valued part of the BBC and I know how much the BBC means to Gary. I look forward to him presenting our coverage of Match of the Day this weekend. He also announced that the BBC is going to launch an independent review into its social media guidelines, and there is going to be a focus in particular on freelancers who do not work within news and current affairs. So, of course, that will then apply to Gary Lineker. And Tim Davie did recognise that in the current social media guidelines, there are grey areas that need addressing. Now, Tim Davie did say that in the meantime, Gary Lineker will be abiding by the current social media policy whilst that independent review takes place. But Gary Lineker did not confirm that. Instead, he took to Twitter, he took to his personal page and created a thread. I'm just going to share some of those tweets with you now. He said, after a surreal few days, I'm delighted that we've navigated a way through this. I want to thank my colleagues at BBC Sport for their solidarity. Football is a team game and their backing was overwhelming. He says he's proud to work at the BBC, can't wait to be back on Match of the Day. But he goes on to share a final thought, and that is this. However difficult the last few days have been, it simply doesn't compare to having to flee your home from persecution or war to seek refuge in a land far away. It's heartwarming to have seen the empathy towards their plight from so many of you. We remain a country of predominantly tolerant, welcoming and generous people. Thank you. So it does seem as though Gary Lineker took the opportunity to double down on his previous comments, those comments that were made last Tuesday that snowballed into this row over BBC impartiality, but also freedom of speech. And he does say pretty much in his comments that he stands firm by them. But he does go on to say that he thanks Tim Davie for his understanding during this difficult period. It does appear to be a very respectful agreement between Gary Lineker and the BBC, and perhaps there will be changes ahead for freelancers in terms of what they can share on social media. But for now, Gary Lineker seems to be at least free to tweet just as he was before.
Ellie, thank you very much for updating us there at New Broadcasting House. More reaction, of course, to come through the afternoon. Also coming up, the government's illegal migration bill. Remember that? Stop the boats. Well, it's getting the second reading later. We'll have more with Tom Harwood, our Deputy Political Editor in Westminster. First, an update on the weather. It's going to get cold again.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Some big variations across the country through the next few days. Wet and windy for England and Wales during today. Mild for most, but in the north, it's going to turn colder as this area of low pressure moves away. That's bringing some wet weather to Scotland, Northern England, Northern Ireland at the moment. But as it clears, northerly winds return, turning the precipitation back to snow. In fact, we're already seeing some snowfall over the Highlands, and that will continue through the rest of the day. Otherwise, rain at lower levels for much of Scotland, showers into Northern Ireland, spells of wet weather for Northern England and much of Wales, and some heavy downpours for southern parts of England. Not a great deal of sunshine about, but there will be some brighter interludes for East Anglia, the East Midlands, and here temperatures could reach 12 to 15 Celsius. But colder air is on the way, coming down from the north, and that'll turn the rain to snow across parts of Scotland into Northern Ireland, Northern England. Mostly this will be settling over hills, but at lower levels, the risk of some icy patches as the showers drift south, and it's going to be a chillier night, with temperatures dipping below freezing across Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, but staying above freezing for southern parts of England and Wales. Showers moving through first thing across southern England, then brighter skies follow for much of the UK, but there'll be further showers for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England and North Wales, and these showers will be falling as sleet and snow at lower levels, generally not accumulating at lower levels, but accumulating over the hills of North Wales, Northern England and Scotland through the day on Tuesday. And again, some icy patches expected to develop overnight and into the start of Wednesday. Showers then drifting south once again on Tuesday night, followed by clear skies and a cold night in some parts of northern Scotland, temperatures dipping into the minus double digits. But much milder air is on the way for Thursday and Friday, with some wet weather in the west.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Let's update you on the latest in the so-called Stop the Boat story, because the House of Commons is to hold the second reading of the government's illegal migration bill. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, announcing, of course, last week that legislation would allow for the removal of the Channel migrants from the UK. Under the proposals, those attempting to cross the water then banned from any future re-entry and blocked, indeed, from applying for British citizenship. Well, the Home Secretary saying the bill would push the boundaries of international law too, but that was needed, she said, to solve what was a crisis, her words. Well, ahead of that reading, let's cross to Westminster and speak to our Deputy Political Editor, Tom Harwood. Tom, what is the state now on the back benches? Because clearly, as well as Labour's opposition, there were some on the Tory benches as well, raising their eyebrows at the language being used here.
Yes, you're right. So far, one Conservative backbench member of Parliament, Caroline Noakes, has said she will not be supporting the bill, will be voting against the bill, perhaps, later on today. She's a former immigration minister herself and now chairs the Women and Equalities Committee in the House of Commons. Seen to be on the left of the party, so perhaps it doesn't really show a big strain of discontent within the Conservative Party. It's very unlikely that this bill will not pass its second reading, its first formal vote within Parliament this evening. However, there's also a keen eye to keep looking at Theresa May, who I learned over this weekend is expected to make an intervention on this bill, perhaps to do with the elements of modern slavery, the legislation that Theresa May passed and views as part of her legacy, which to some extent is being peeled back for people who arrive here illegally under the terms of the illegal migration bill. So certainly some Conservative backbench figures to keep an eye on this evening. And of course, the Labour Party and the SNP and the Lib Dems have all promoted wrecking amendments to this legislation as well. They'll be opposing it in the Commons later on today. However, it does seem very, very unlikely that this legislation will fail. It has the broad support of most Tory MPs, and of course the Conservative Party still has a sizable majority in the House of Commons.
So obviously the numbers stack up, but do we then think that the House of Lords will try to add certain amendments, given what the Home Secretary herself has said about the questionable legal status of some of these moves?
I think it's without doubt that we're going to be in for what's called a round of parliamentary ping-pong, where the bill goes from the Commons to the Lords, back to the Commons, because the Lords will add in all sorts of amendments, and then the Commons will have to strip out those amendments, and then they'll go back to the Lords. It's officially called ping-pong, but ultimately the House of Commons is the democratic chamber, and therefore it will have the moral authority over the Lords, despite, no doubt, a lot of the legal minds in the House of Lords thinking that there is a lot to disagree with about this policy.
Tom at Westminster, thank you for that. And, of course, we'll see what emerges in that debate as the afternoon continues. Also coming up, we'll be updating you from Swansea on the major incident declared after the gas explosion, speaking to the local council about how they're trying to cope. But first, let's get an update on that news and all the other headlines with Tamsin.
Thank you, Mark. Here are the headlines at 1:31. A major incident has been declared in Swansea after a suspected gas explosion in the Morriston area. Leader of the local council, Rob Stewart, says emergency services are on site responding to the incident. It's not yet known whether there are any injuries. TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and said the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of the collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt says the government worked urgently to look after the tech sector, confirming all customer deposits would be protected with no cost to the taxpayer. The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met with his Australian counterpart in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with the US President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. It was signed by the three nations in 2021 to boost defences and counter China's threat in the Indo-Pacific region. Junior doctors are staging 3 days of industrial action. The British Medical Association says junior doctors in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, which they say is less than a barista in a coffee shop. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has called it incredibly disappointing. The union has declined to discuss pay on the condition strikes are paused. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Let's update with some breaking news. We're getting on yet another BBC presenter and comments made on air, this time not on social media. It regards Fiona Bruce, who is now to step down from her role as an ambassador with the domestic abuse charity Refuge. She says with real sadness, following comments she made on Thursday's edition of Question Time on the BBC. Now, just to give you the circumstances, she said she was required to legally contextualise, as she says, a question about Stanley Johnson, father of Boris Johnson. She said those words have been taken as an expression of my own opinions, which they are absolutely not, and as a minimising of domestic abuse, which I would never do. Now, she's indicated that on the programme on March the 9th, she interrupted panel member Tasmin Alibi-Brown to say that Stanley Johnson's alleged history of violence was on record. Fiona Bruce saying, I'm not disputing what you're saying, but just so everyone knows, this is referring to Stanley Johnson's wife speaking to a journalist, Tom Bauer, saying that Stanley Johnson had broken her nose and she ended up in hospital as a result. Stanley Johnson has not commented publicly on that, she said, and friends of his have said it did happen, but it was a one-off. Now, subsequently, Fiona Bruce saying that she was a passionate advocate and campaigner for all survivors of domestic abuse, but there'd been a hard decision for her to make in terms of deciding to step down from her role as ambassador with Refuge, with real sadness. So another issue of course, comments from BBC presenters, although she's indicating in this circumstance it was to legally contextualise those issues as regards Stanley Johnson. More on that as we get it, but let's reflect now on more international news, with Argentina being accused of placing the Falklands now in an economic stranglehold. It's ripped up, apparently, a key cooperation agreement, demanding fresh talks, indeed, on the island's sovereignty. Well, all this coming as islanders mark the 10th anniversary of a referendum vote where they voted overwhelmingly to remain British. Our Home Security Editor, Mark White, has the latest for us.
Across the Falklands, they're marking a decade since they voted by a staggering 99.8% to remain British. Although overseen by international observers, the results of that referendum have never been recognised by the Argentinian government. 7 years ago, Buenos Aires and London effectively agreed to disagree over the island's sovereignty and signed up to a pact aimed at improving economic, environmental and social relations. But this week, all that ended as the Argentinians ripped up the agreement and demanded fresh talks over the future of the Falklands.
We're always disappointed with the reaction from Argentina, but we're not at all surprised. It's something that we've come to live with, and we understand them very, very clearly. When the economy and when the political situation in Argentina gets tough, then we are the sort of whipping boys from their point of view.
The Argentinian economy is in meltdown. Critics of the government in Buenos Aires accuse it of reigniting the row over Falkland sovereignty to distract from its domestic troubles. On a practical level, though, any withdrawal from the cooperation agreement will hurt the islands.
It has impacted the Falklands because we can't share fisheries data with Argentina because of the migration of the fish stock in the ocean. We've lost a flight to Sao Paulo, which was our second link to South America. And also the agreement benefited Argentina because it helped identify the war dead from the war. So I don't really think anyone comes out better for this agreement coming to an end.
With more than 1,000 British military personnel, Typhoon fighters and a Royal Navy presence, The Falklands is far better defended now than before the war in '82. No one here believes Argentina has the slightest interest or indeed capability to threaten the islands militarily. But for the time being at least, it seems determined to ramp up the diplomatic and economic pressure despite the express wish of this island community. Mark White, GB News.
Well, let's speak once more now to the Honourable Roger Spink, Chairman of the Falkland Islands Chamber of Commerce, who we saw in Mark's report. Roger, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us live here on GB News. How safe do you feel there at the Falklands at the moment?
I think people in the Falklands feel very safe indeed. You know, the MOD have a substantial base within the islands, and we are very assured as to our safety from the UK government.
But clearly increased belligerence, whether it's economic or otherwise, from the Argentine source. What does that mean for you now in terms of trade and everyday supplies and the sort of everyday life, if you like?
Well, what it does mean is that we're unable to restart the second flight we had through to Sao Paulo, which stopped in Cordoba, which allowed Argentine veterans to visit once a month. So we're unable to set up that second link. So we only have one weekly link to South America available. But it probably will have limited effect in other areas, because we've learnt over the last 40 years to live and operate despite our neighbours. And you know, it's very sad 40 years on from the conflict that Argentina still is belligerent towards the people of the Falklands.
Yeah, and still calling it Las Malvinas, of course, as we know. Do you think then, therefore, it's time for maybe another referendum 10 years on to remind them about how people there feel, or do you believe Buenos Aires would just ignore that anyway?
I think they would probably ignore it, but I think that what they've done over the last 10 years is actually hardened the attitude of people in the islands, that, you know, there is nothing to gain by being friendly with Argentina. They seem all the time to try and undermine everything that we do and the democratic rights of the people of the Falklands.
Could they squeeze you further, though, economically, in terms of fishing and so on, and, of course, the whole issue of oil as well, which could be vital for the long-term prosperity of the islands?
I think if they could, they would, and they have done in the past. But I think a lot of this is posturing. There is an election in Argentina towards the end of this year, and when times are hard in Argentina, it's usually a distraction for their population rather than anything else.
Yeah, so you've been there before, if you like.
We certainly have, and we will succeed despite our neighbours.
Roger Spink, Chairman of the Falkland Islands Chamber of Commerce, thanks very much for updating us and joining us live from the Falklands. Not often that we can say that, but great to speak to you. Now, let's reflect on this major incident being declared in Swansea after reports of a gas explosion at a house there. Emergency services responding to the report of the junction of Field Close and Clydach Road in Morriston. These are the pictures we're just getting in of the devastation. One house appearing to have been completely flattened, another seriously damaged, but we believe no reports of injuries at the moment. But let's bring in now Rob Stewart, who's leader of Swansea Council. Thanks very much for updating us, Rob. What are you learning there at the scene?
Yeah, thank you. I'm on the scene at the moment and been talking to residents and trying to reassure them. The emergency services are here, obviously, and our focus at the moment is just to make sure that we account for everyone, and that's the process that's ongoing at the moment, to try and ensure that everybody's accounted for and safe. And then those residents who are being displaced at the moment, we've set up a centre nearby for them, so that they have somewhere safe and warm to go until they can return safely to their properties. So it is a major explosion, as you said. or one property completely destroyed and a second very badly damaged.
I know it's early days yet, but the belief is that everyone is safe at the moment.
At the moment, we are unable to say that because we are still trying to account for everyone. But that's the work that the police and the fire services are doing at the moment, is tracing everybody to make sure we can account for them.
Right. Well, looking at the scale of the devastation, clearly you've got to make sure that the rest of the street is safe and find out what's gone on. Does that mean that many of these people will probably have to be housed overnight at your centre?
It's a possibility. You know, when you're in the street here, you can certainly smell gas in terms of the remnants of the explosion. It's also disturbed the electricity supply in the area. So that's what the technicians are working on at the moment. But there is a possibility that people will need to be housed overnight.
OK, and clearly you'll be looking as to whether there were any reports of gas being smelt previously. I mean, you are also Deputy Leader of Welsh Local Government. I mean, what sort of state is the infrastructure in? I mean, one assumes that looking at these, Victorian terraces, that some of the pipework may be quite old.
No, there's no suggestion of that. This looks like a localised incident. Okay. And, certainly the area of Morriston is a modern area, and there's no suggestion of any sort of infrastructural issues at the present time. OK, so people should be reassured then? Indeed.
OK, well, Rob, thank you very much for updating us there at the scene. And as we say, we hope that the news is good in terms of those people who were caught there, and we'll get updates as the afternoon progresses. Thank you very much indeed. Now, today, the first Commonwealth Day since Her Majesty's passing, the first presided then by His Majesty King Charles III as King and head, therefore, of the Commonwealth. He will deliver a message to mark the occasion from the great pulpit in Westminster Abbey later. And the theme, we're told, is forging a sustainable and peaceful common future. Let's get more with our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, joining us. And Cameron, on that theme, it's a fairly apposite thing as we see all these various problems across the Commonwealth and the wider globe.
Certainly is, Mark. And speaking of problems, there are a number of separate, different protest groups here outside Westminster Abbey. I'll just run through a couple of them. First of all, we've got anti-monarchy protesters Republic. They are here protesting the fact that they do not want a hereditary head of state. Now, there has been some criticism of the fact that they are here, because many are saying that the King is here in his capacity as the new head of the Commonwealth. And as you said, Mark, it was a decision which was made in 2018 following the Commonwealth Heads of Governments meeting, because it's Queen Elizabeth II's wish that her son, Charles, would one day succeed her as head of the Commonwealth. But anti-monarchy protest group Republic, they are saying, well, wherever the King goes, he is still an unelected head of a state, and that's what they have a problem with. The other big protest today, which we were speaking about on breakfast on GB News this morning, is the LGBT plus human rights protesters, who are saying that 22 of the 56 Commonwealth nations have anti-LGBT plus laws, and 7 of which you can actually get life imprisonment for being homosexual. So there's a big noisy protest group just over to my right. We'll see if we can get some pictures to you, or you can have a look on our social media for that. But in terms of what's going on today, it is the first Commonwealth Day service for His Majesty the King as head of the Commonwealth. As you said, it is forging a sustainable and peaceful common future. That is the theme of 2023, and it comes off the back of a pretty frosty relationship, isn't it, between the King, Buckingham Palace, and what's going on with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex on the other side of the Atlantic. And of course, it was 2020's Commonwealth Day service which was the final engagement of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex as working members of the royal family. And if you remember, there was a few, let's say, frosty looks between the senior members of the royal family back then. But there's also going to be a big focus on sustainability. 60% of Commonwealth citizens across the 56 nations are under the age of 30. So there is a big focus on youth-led action, and it's expected that His Majesty, during his speech, which he will be delivering at the Great Pulpit here in Westminster Abbey, will reflect sustainability and climate change. Several members of the royal family are going to be here: the King, Queen Consort, Prince and Princess of Wales, the new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh as well, Mark, and the Princess Royal and Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence. And I think it's going to be one of the last occasions we'll see the King and Queen Consort inside Westminster Abbey ahead of their coronation in a couple of months' time. But fact, according to the papers this morning, Buckingham Palace's ballroom has been transformed into a makeshift Westminster Abbey so they can rehearse in private ahead of the big day.
And given what you've just said, Cameron, we can hear the noise from the protests. Is there perhaps going to be a reassessment then about the coronation? And I know security perhaps will be a little tighter for that occasion than this particular Commonwealth Day, and there are political circumstances attached to this, but it may well be exercising some minds at the degree of protest today.
Yes, and there seems to be a steady build-up of anti-monarchy protests, Mark. This is the third occasion now in the space of a couple of months where we have seen a public engagement which the King is attending, which has had quite a noisy minority, I must stress, but a minority of very noisy protesters who are very much anti-monarchy. The first was Milton Keynes, then we had Colchester, and now today we've got them here at the Commonwealth Day service, and they are expected to have a big protest here at Westminster Abbey on Coronation Day itself. But I think we live in a democracy, don't we? And the Commonwealth is a family of nations, 56 nations, and they strive towards a shared interest in terms of social and economic prosperity. And perhaps some countries are slightly more developed than others. But there's going to be 2,000 strong congregation inside, made up of a diverse mix of people. There's going to be performances, West End performances. There's government ministers expected to attend, the Commonwealth Secretary General as well. So it's going to be a pretty packed day, but nonetheless there are very noisy protesters here outside Westminster Abbey today.
Thank you very much for updating us at Westminster Abbey, and of course more from inside the Abbey a little later. But let's bring in now Nicholas Owen, former ITN Royal correspondent and author, of course, on very many royal matters. And Nicholas, interesting to hear actually the noise of that protest there, and perhaps giving some food for thought for those planning the coronation.
Yes, bound to be. I must say, Cameron's quite right. This is now the third time we've heard these noisy people on the street. He was emphasising quite rightly they are a small minority, but it obviously, when you get people like that together, always difficult for the police to organise things. You never quite know, out of the back of that crowd there might be somebody with rather more malign intentions. We had a bit of egg throwing, you remember, earlier on. All sounds very harmless, doesn't it? There we are seeing, I think these are live pictures, Mark?
I think that this was an earlier visit, I think, from memory at Colchester, which, as you quite rightly corrected me, is now a garrison city rather than a garrison town, when it was given city status, which is the last time we saw the royal couple together. But clearly, I mean, just looking at the message of today's Commonwealth Day, raging or forging a sustainable and peaceful common future, this is quite tricky for the Commonwealth, given, as many of the protests today are pointing up, the difference in sort of cultural approaches by these countries.
Yes, you're quite right. And one correction deserves another, Mark, I must say. Well done, you. Well done, you.
One all score draw. There we are.
Yeah, one all so far. And let's mention footballer Gary Lineker. Right, OK. Always a very sensitive business, anything to do with the Commonwealth. It's a bit of a tricky institution to understand, actually. 15 realms there, and then all these other countries as well. The realms are actually ones where the king now is actually head of state. So it's always a bit of a tricky path that's got to be tread. Interesting thing about today to me is that he's actually going to make a speech on the subject. Now, his mother, the late Queen, she avoided speech making on these occasions. She just went along to Commonwealth Day, but he's actually going to be saying things about sustainability and all the other things. But there's bound to be those who are going to watch for everything that shows the slightest sign of not politics exactly, but a nod towards exactly the issues that you're talking about, the very diversity of the Commonwealth. Very good in some ways, but there are some traps along the way that his advisors will be very, very keen to keep an eye on.
We've got the reception as normal at Buckingham Palace afterwards, and clearly, you know, the message of continuity and how important the Commonwealth was to Queen Elizabeth II, that's being continued.
Yes, absolutely. The Queen made it clear right back at the time of her coronation back in 1953 that she valued the way the Commonwealth was set up, making the point, emphasising it wasn't like the old empire. We're talking about countries that are all hopefully, most of them anyway, democratic. Everybody are talking about the desire for freedom and peace. But as we keep saying, there are great differences between these countries. And of course, the Commonwealth has not been static either. The Barbados recently was last year, I think, wasn't it, actually left the Commonwealth. Jamaica is threatening to do so. Maybe even Australia might declare itself a republic, but stay presumably within the Commonwealth. All sorts of shades of grey in this. And people will always be asking themselves, what is the relevance? What is the relevance in this modern world? Unless you see democratic norms right across an organisation like this and on subjects like, LGBT and so on. Unless you see an absolutely common purpose there, what's the point of the Commonwealth? Be careful of that. But on the other hand, you're never going to get standards right across, are you? So it is a pretty tricky one. People will be studying the King's words on this very, very carefully indeed.
Nicholas, relevant as ever. Thank you very much indeed for that. And, of course, we'll see what's being said from that pulpit in Westminster Abbey. We hope to have those pictures a little later. And, of course, as Cameron was reflecting, updating on the protest taking place in Parliament Square there outside. All the latest coming up for you. Also coming up, we'll be updating you from the United States. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, is in San Diego with the Prime Minister, due to meet President Biden. And also, we're talking about Australia. The Australian Prime Minister, Albanese, is there as well. The meeting taking place, we understand, at the moment. We'll have all the latest from that. Plus, the biggest strike in the NHS history. We'll be updating you on what's the effect is taking place. But let's take a look at the weather for you now.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Dubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Very good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst. And coming up for you this hour, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in the United States to finalise a major defence deal with President Joe Biden of the US and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He's also announced £5 billion in extra defence spending for Britain's armed forces in the next 2 years. We'll be asking a former general whether it's enough to actually win a Cold War. Junior doctors have begun a 3-day walkout. Their union, the BMA, claiming some are now being paid less than coffee baristas at Pret-a-Manger. So, what price life-saving treatment at our hospitals? Can the medics swallow the bitter taste of just £14 an hour? And the King's first Commonwealth Day as monarch, trying to help unite the sometimes fractious community during his reign. But protests outside Westminster Abbey. We'll have the latest with our royal reporter there. And what's your view of everything that's going on? Get in touch with us as ever at gbviews@gbnews.uk. Before that, an update on all the headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thanks very much and good afternoon from the GB Newsroom. It's 2:01. A major incident has been declared in Swansea after a suspected gas explosion in the Morriston area. Emergency services are on site responding to the incident after being called to the area just after 11:20 this morning. It's not yet known whether there are any injuries. Leader of the local council, Rob Stewart, has said one property has been completely destroyed and a second very badly damaged. He told GB News the focus at the moment is to make sure everybody is accounted for and safe.
You're in the street here, you can certainly smell gas in terms of, the remnants of the explosion. It's also disturbed the electricity supply in the area. This looks like a localised incident. And, certainly the area of Morriston is a modern area and there's no suggestion of any sort of infrastructural issues at the present time.
TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and says the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. Earlier, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the spotlight really needs to be on the chairman.
I think Richard Sharp's position is increasingly untenable. Obviously, there's a process going on. But I think most people watching the complete mess of the last few days would say, how on earth is he still in position? And Gary Lineker has been taken off air. This is a mess of the BBC's own making.
Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg has questioned the validity of the BBC's licence fee.
We are all in favour of freedom of speech and people being allowed to say things that we don't agree with or we may even find offensive, and that's absolutely fine. He can say what he likes. The issue is that the BBC is the state broadcaster and that it's funded by a tax on televisions. If it weren't, then we wouldn't need to worry about its impartiality. And actually, if we changed the funding mechanism of the BBC, we could have a much freer media.
Former BBC executive and presenter Roger Bolton has questioned why BBC chairman Richard Sharp has not yet spoken out on the matter.
Rightly or wrongly, Richard Sharp, because of his connections with Boris Johnson, because of the fact that he's been investigated for that relationship and what he revealed about it, and because he was almost totally absent, well, not almost, he was totally absent this weekend when the DG needed some help. He didn't step up, he didn't talk about impartiality, probably because he knew the second question people like you would put to him was, can we talk about your links to Boris Johnson?
In a sit-down interview with the BBC, the organisation's Director General says he thinks he's done the right thing.
I've always said we need to take proportionate action. For some people, by the way, we've taken too severe action, David. Others think we're being too lenient. One of the joys of this affair is there'd never been an easy solution, but asking Gary to step back off air was, I think, a significant thing. And now we look forward with this agreement moving forward to resolve things and get back to business as usual.
In other news, the Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt says the government had worked urgently to look after the tech sector. More than 200 companies were facing risks to cash flow before the intervention, with around £2.5 billion in capital locked in the lender.
All those really important companies that had deposits with Silicon Valley Bank UK can access their deposits, can access normal banking services as of this morning. It's a very important outcome. No taxpayers' money has been used, and I think it's a result of a lot of hard work. But I also think it shows that the UK has great resilience in its financial system, that we're able to step in with one of our biggest UK banks in a situation like this and protect a very important sector.
The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. It was signed by the three nations in 2021 to boost defences and counter China's threat in the Indo-Pacific region. Junior doctors are mounting picket lines outside hospitals for 3 days of industrial action.
What do we want? When do we want it? Now!
The British Medical Association says junior doctors in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, which it says is less than a barista in a coffee shop. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says the 35% pay rise demand is unaffordable.
We're working extremely hard with NHS England and with hospital bosses to mitigate the impact of the junior doctor strike. That is why it's important that we engage in meaningful and constructive talks with them. We stand ready to engage with the junior doctors on that, in exactly the same way we have with other health unions. And I urge the junior doctors to come and have those discussions, as the other health unions have been doing, so we can pause the strikes and discuss those issues.
Britain set to be hit by further wintry blasts today, with 51 flood alerts in place across the UK. The Met Office has issued a yellow warning for strong winds across parts of England and Wales, with gusts of up to 65 miles per hour forecast and travel disruption expected. In Scotland, yellow warnings for snow and ice are in place until tomorrow morning, where temperatures have plunged to -8 degrees over the weekend. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thanks very much indeed. So, Rishi Sunak in the United States to meet President Joe Biden and the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to seal a major defence deal. Well, the Prime Minister arrived in San Diego last night to discuss Australia's procurement of nuclear-powered submarines under the so-called AUKUS Pact. Mr Albanese is expected to announce a plan for a British-designed fleet with US boats being purchased as a stopgap measure. Well, let's get the very latest now with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who's in San Diego. And Darren, as we speak to you, we understand Joe Biden flying now from Washington for this meeting, I think at the naval base in San Diego. Is that right?
Yeah, indeed, some of the submarines are based here, Mark. That's the reason the Prime Minister's flown quite a long way, for a very short period of time, it must be said, to California this morning. As you say, he arrived late yesterday afternoon, went straight into work, had a working dinner with the Australian Prime Minister last night, though it gives you a sense of the kind of level of excitement at these meetings. That the big talking point for the Press Association at that dinner was who was having still or sparkling water. But yes, they are essentially extending this AUKUS deal, that is to supply submarines to Australia, nuclear-powered submarines. You may remember it was signed initially a couple of years ago, actually, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. And this is all to see off the perceived threat of China in the Indo-Pacific. Not least of all, of course, Australia is a country on its own somewhat done there in terms of its defence capabilities, and that is why the UK is hooked up with Australia and the US in regards to these submarines. Prime Minister pretty clear on the plane on the way over yesterday that, you know, when you look at where China is now in terms of what it's doing in that region and indeed globally, that all the signals from the British point of view, from a Western point of view, are going in the wrong way, that they are becoming more aggressive, more interfering, as I say, not just in the region, globally as well. And that is why they want to ensure that there is a form of military stability in that part of the world.
Yeah.
So met with President Albanese last night. Today they're going to all meet as a kind of three-way, if you like, a little later on, and then there's going to be a bilateral meeting with President Biden just before he hops back on the plane to go back to the UK.
And back here, of course, Ben Wallace has won more money for the MOD, not quite as much as he was wanting to, but, you know, an indication of this reassessment of the global threat, particularly, as you're saying, with the Pacific, of China and its moves perhaps towards Taiwan.
Yeah, indeed. Of course, that is a massive, massive concern. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty about what China may well do. We know what their ambitions clearly are. I mean, China's been pretty clear about that. You know, they do want Taiwan to become a fully integrated part of the Chinese People's Republic. The question is, how far are they willing to go to do that? Is there the possibility of military action? And what would the response of the West be? You know, Russia is in a different ballpark to China. And you're right, though, at the same time, with that increased defence spending, £5 billion, a lot of it's going to go on the AUKUS scheme. Some of it's going to go, though, to replace those weapons that have been depleted from the war in Ukraine. But at the moment, the UK is kind of struggling to a degree, I would suggest, with trying to ensure that it is focused, of course, on war in Europe and the sanctions on Russia and trying to support Ukraine, but at the same time having to keep more than half an eye on what's happening on the other side of the world.
The other aspect, there's quite an interesting article in the Financial Times today, actually looking at the backlog, if you like, in the delivery for submarines, both for the UK itself and what the Americans are trying to do. They're trying to build 17 vessels, never mind supplying these new AUKUS craft. So there's a question as to whether we can actually deliver on whatever is agreed there today.
No, and that is going to be a continuing question in terms of defence procurement, you know, not just for months, but for years and years and years to come, not least of all because we're supplying so many weapons. I mean, when I say we, I mean collectively the West. It's not just the UK, but the United States, where I am right now, but places like France and Germany as well, that there is a bit of a backlog in terms of defence procurement and the defence kind of industry's capabilities and abilities to kind of crank up, if you like, the amount of weapons they can supply. And that's why we may well see an interim measure in terms of the lending of some of these submarines from the United States initially. But this is all about sending a message, isn't it, really, fundamentally? It's about saying that actually, at the end of the day, with the rise of China, we always use that term, the rise of China, but, you know, China is now a pretty prominent military force as well as an economic one, that actually the West is willing at least to collectively work together to stand up for what they see their interests are, and in some ways to essentially be a buffer zone for China in certain regions around the world. China hasn't got the global reach of the United States, but clearly, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, it is now a really, really strong military power.
Darren, in a very picturesque-looking San Diego, thanks for updating us. We'll let you head down to the naval base, which perhaps won't be quite as picturesque. But thanks for updating us there in California. Let's, as Darren was saying, reflect more on that $5 billion for the UK military over 2 years. And Rishi Sunak insisting the armed forces have the funding needed for a more volatile world, as he called it, in the face of the growing challenges, particularly posed by China and Russia. Well, a significant amount of that new cash to be used to renew ammunition stockpiles because of what's been happening in Ukraine, of course, and as we discussed, the submarines for Australia. Let's speak now to retired British Army General Sir Richard Barrons and what he makes of the mood music, if you like. Thank you very much indeed for joining us as they discuss the matters in San Diego and perhaps trying to tot up the bill as well, I guess.
Yeah, so this extra $5 billion really only does two things. It cements this very important deal with the United States and Australia, which is currently about nuclear submarines, but it will span into other things over time. And the only other thing this new money does is it commits £500 million or so to buy more ammunition to replace the ammunition given to Ukraine, and I think to buy Ukraine more ammunition in due course. The new money doesn't do any more than that.
OK, and I think going forward, defence spending at about 2.5% of GDP, where we believe, Ben Wallace was looking more towards 3%. I mean, he would always aim high, of course, to try and get a bit of extra money. But what would that do in terms of balancing this new global threat, as they're talking about from both Russia and China as well?
So one of the very key things in this review is it says that UK will move up to 2.5% of GDP on defence. But it doesn't say when, and it doesn't say on what that money would be spent on. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, had asked for as much as an extra £11 billion now, and he was asking for that money to make up for the shock effect on the defence budget of inflation and the fall in the value of pound, and also to recognise that the army in particular right now is in very poor shape for reasons that I think many others have set out. And interestingly, what this refresh of the review doesn't do is address any of those problems now. It moves all those problems down to a review in about 2025.
Right. And what about what we've spent already? I mean, I gather we've had terrible problems with this new tank that we've been trying to get into service. As I said, the Financial Times today pointing out the difficulties of getting these submarines delivered, bearing in mind the backlog in the States and, of course, in Barrow and Furness. Yeah. Are we actually perhaps pouring money down a bit of a black hole?
So one of the features of the Treasury's response to Mr. Wallace's request for more money is that we give you a lot of money and you spend it very badly because the defence acquisition process is not delivering land, sea or air. And this is an entirely fair point. It is now essential to reform defence acquisition. There's plenty of good thought about how to do that so that our money is spent better. But the fact is the UK is still choosing not to act like France and Germany right now and put more money into conventional forces, in particular to give us an army that could deal with a Russian attack at less than 5 years' notice, which is about where we are now.
Yeah, and last thought, just on the sort of political and diplomatic front, what do you think that both Moscow and Beijing will be making of this meeting in San Diego?
Well, first of all, they'll look very carefully at the conclusions that it makes about the Asia-Pacific region. And it is a very clear statement of intent that a relationship between the UK, Australia and America is important. And then I think when they read the detail of the document, they will sense a hardening of the UK's position on defence and security generally. And this is a lot more than the military. This stretches into diplomacy and cyber and the resilience of industry. This is becoming a very different proposition. But the big financial questions have basically been thrown over the fence to 2025.
Yeah. So, Richard, thank you very much indeed for joining us on GB News with your assessment. Thank you very much. And, of course, we'll update you from San Diego with Darren there, our political editor, on that particular meeting. But let's update you now on the situation here with the hospitals across England cancelling tens of thousands of outpatient appointments, operations, even cancer treatment, as junior doctors start their 3 days of industrial action. As many as 61,000 junior doctors, trainee doctors too, staging the 72-hour stoppage in pursuit of what they say should be a 26% pay rise. Well, NHS trusts in England postponing many more procedures than for any recent walkouts by nurses and ambulance staff for obvious reasons. Let's get the thoughts now from former Health Secretary Stephen Dorrell, also a former chair, of course, of the NHS Confederation. Mr. Dorrell, thank you very much indeed for your time. First of all, just the assessment of where we are in the industrial relations, because the BMA were pointing out, Dr. Robert Lawrenson, chair of the Junior Doctors Committee. They'd gone to many meetings, but Stephen Barclay, the Health Secretary, had only turned up to one of them.
Well, I think that's very surprising, to be honest, and I think it's a pattern, unfortunately, that we've seen since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, which is that he knew in October, we all knew in October, this was going to be a difficult winter for the health service. And there were some pay issues that needed to be resolved with the whole of the medical profession, actually, but also, of course, with nurses and ambulance staff and all the other disputes we've seen going on over recent months.
What has pointed up this? Sorry to interrupt. I just said, just to point up, of course, on that particular issue, we've got the BMA also saying, look, we've got junior doctors starting at £14 an hour. That's less than a barista, a pret-a-manger. I mean, a lot of people out there will be thinking, how on earth has this situation been allowed to develop?
Well, I think that's the key point. I don't think that you can get involved in individual pay negotiations on a television channel, to be honest.
No.
Which is why I'm a strong supporter of the review body mechanism that takes these issues away, takes evidence, and produces a considered response. But that's what the government should have been dealing with from October onwards. And yet what we've had week after week after week is new disputes arising, most recently, of course, the junior doctors.
And, of course, it means now that the BMA is in a position where it says it needs a 26% deal to catch up in real terms. Clearly, that's not going to be palatable for the government. And therefore, perhaps do they have partial responsibility for allowing it to get to that stage?
Well, that is exactly my point, that I do believe the government have allowed themselves to drift into a succession of avoidable pay disputes with different grades of NHS staff. We had the issue with the nurses, didn't we? That we were told they couldn't afford a 19% increase. No, I don't believe anybody expects either 19% for nurses or 26% for doctors. What we do expect is ministers to engage in serious and, most importantly, timely discussions to achieve agreements that avoid these kind of disputes.
What is the exit strategy? What is the way out? Because we do know that perhaps the Chancellor has rather more headroom, as they say, in terms of tax receipts being increased and so on. Does the Treasury maybe have a bit more to play with now?
Well, I think it is true the Treasury has a bit more to play with, but I fear what actually has happened is that the cost of settling these disputes has been rising because the government hasn't gripped the issue over the last, now getting on for 5 months. We should have had settlements of these issues months ago.
And is there also a reassessment now of a whole approach, maybe existential approach to a national health service and what the NHS does? Bearing in mind that the nurses, now the doctors are saying it's not just about pay, it's the fact that we don't think the service is being valued in looking after people.
Well, I think you will take the public with you if you argue that doctors and nurses and other NHS staff should be properly paid. You will also take the public with you, I think, if you recognise that the NHS, of course, needs to change in response to changing circumstances. In particular, needs to be regarded as a single health and care system dealing with the joins between social care and the NHS. Where you won't take the public with you is if you argue that because there are serious issues in healthcare, we need to rethink the NHS model. I don't agree with that. I think the model can work, should work, is actually the right model, and it's for ministers to address the issues necessary to make it work.
So therefore, do you think Stephen Barclay is right when he starts talking about productivity in terms of buying the pay deals? Because one wonders, how on earth do you make a health service increase productivity as if it's some kind of factory producing widgets?
Yes, I think it's an unfortunate word. I understand what you're saying about that. But I think anybody who's worked in the health service over the last 70-odd years, nearly 75 years coming up this year, knows that of course, when new drugs come forward or new technology comes forward, there are opportunities to do things in the health service that the previous generations simply couldn't imagine. That's what the economists, in a rather dry word, call productivity. And yes, it does mean changing the way we deliver healthcare. For example, there are many more consultations take place remotely now. Those are often more accessible to patients, and they're often a more efficient way of using resources. Not always. Face-to-face is also important. But that's an example of how things need to change. I agree with change. What I regret is the fact that we've drifted along dealing with, it's a very old-fashioned issue, If you want people to deliver high quality services, doctors, nurses, ambulance staff, the rest, you have to pay them properly. And that's what the government have been slow to deal with over the last few months.
Stephen Dorrell, former Health Secretary and former Chair of the NHS Confederation, thanks very much indeed for that. You're watching GB News Live. Also coming up, the government's illegal migration bill. Remember that? Stop the boats. Well, it's got a second reading today. The Home Secretary saying the bill will push the boundaries of international law. So what will the MPs make of it? We'll be updating you.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now, in just under 2 hours, the House of Commons to hold the second reading of the government's illegal migration bill. The Home Secretary Suella Braverman, of course, announcing last week that legislation would allow for the removal of channel migrants from the UK. And under the proposals, those attempting to cross the water banned from any future re-entry and then blocked from applying for British citizenship. Let's speak to our political reporter, Catherine Forster, now, who joins us in the studio, because there were concerns, obviously, not just from Labour, but some Tory backbenchers as well, as to how far these measures went and whether, in fact, they were going to break international treaties and international law.
Yes, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, wrote last week that she thought there was over a 50% chance of it breaking breach of international law, didn't she? And certainly there are some, although I feel certain that this bill will pass, there are quite a few Tory MPs not very happy. Now, there are some on the right unhappy in that they think it doesn't go far enough, people like Ian Duncan-Smith that want to take on the ECHR head-on. But there are others, like Caroline Noakes, who's come out today and said, I cannot vote for this. And
although, I mean, she would accept that she's on the left wing of the party.
She would, but she said she can't vote for it because, obviously, she was formerly an immigration minister. She's chair of the Women's and Equality Select Committee, and she's very concerned about what this means for children coming across, and the idea that potentially children could be detained and then deported, which
treated
is
as criminals, effectively, in her words.
Exactly. Now, my understanding is that they will not be detaining or deporting any unaccompanied minors who arrive, but this bill does open the door to detaining children that would families that would obviously contain under 18s, and that is very problematic. Chris Skidmore is another backbench MP who's come out against this.
The other concern is many of them asking, is this workable? That pledge that Rishi Sunak made, stop the boats, and people saying, will this actually do that?
Well, that's another thing, because there's a lot of private concerns amongst Tory MPs that simply this isn't going to work, because to detain these people and then to deport them, you have to have the returns agreements. You have to know where you're going to send them. Now, when this gets through the Commons and when it gets through the Lords, and it's going to face a bumpy ride in the Lords and in the courts, even if it gets through, unless you've got agreements with countries of where these people are going to go, then it's very difficult.
Now, the key element, of course, this is what I asked Tom earlier about this, he called it ping-pong, of course, with the Lords. I mean, is there sufficient concern there that they may try and alter it to, you know, quite a substantial degree?
There will be a lot of unhappiness in the Lords about this, for sure, and it can go back and forth. And Rishi Sunak is very keen to get this through Parliament, potentially by September, so that he can show results, because, of course, of his 5 pledges that he's made, and he needs to show success on all of these pretty much to have a chance in the next election, which is less than 2 years away. They need to show results. So certainly it'll face a tricky time in the Lords and in the courts.
Yeah, is that particularly to regards Suella Braverman as Home Secretary? She has pinned her political future on actually getting this through and getting it on the statute book.
Yes, she certainly has. And I mean, former Home Secretary Priti Patel is said to be not very happy about this at all in terms of, again, concerns around children. So it is going to be difficult. But having said that he's going to stop the boat, and all the attempts so far that the government has made over the last few years, and the numbers have gone up and up and up, they really do have to deliver something on this. Otherwise, they're going to be punished, aren't they, by lots of voters at the polls.
And hence, of course, what we saw in Paris in terms of that agreement with the French authorities and the extra money, 450 million, I think it was. For
large sums of money, because previously been about 250 million. So a real ramping up, and a hope that if they can get, the French currently stop about 50% of crossings, if they can get it up to 75% of crossings that the French are stopping, that would break the business model of the people smugglers.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll see what, of course, emerges in the Commons a little later. Now, let's take you to Westminster Abbey, because just to update you, we were... actually, I was going to say there's a protest. I don't think that's a protest. That may well be part of the welcoming ceremony for the Commonwealth Day message from King Charles, due at the Great Pulpit in Westminster Abbey shortly, with 2,000 congregation attending this first address by the King. We have people from across the Commonwealth, including High Commissioners, Foreign Affairs Ministers and representatives. And I think our camera is trying to frame up to get all the celebrations there, the QE2 Centre from behind. But Cameron, our royal reporter, was updating us that there have been protests there as well from anti-monarchist groups as well as LGBT protesters. But we'll update you as we get more of that from that on Westminster. But I think time now to get an update. All the other headlines, Tamsin's waiting for us.
Thank you, Mark. Here are the headlines at 2:33. A major incident has been declared after a suspected gas explosion at a property in Swansea. Emergency services are at the scene after being called to the Morriston area this morning. It's not yet known if there are any injuries. Local council leader Rob Stewart says one property has been completely destroyed, with the second very badly damaged. TV presenter Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day after reaching an agreement with the BBC. It's after he was taken off air over a tweet on the government's illegal migration bill. The BBC Director General has apologised and said the corporation is launching an independent review of its social media guidelines. The board has welcomed the move, saying impartiality is a cornerstone of the BBC. The Chancellor and the Bank of England have secured the sale of the collapsed Silicon Valley Bank UK to HSBC for a nominal sum of £1. The UK branch was put into insolvency last night after the California-based parent company had its assets seized by US regulators on Friday. Jeremy Hunt has confirmed all customer deposits would be protected with no cost to the taxpayer. The Prime Minister has pledged £5 billion over 2 years to the armed forces. Rishi Sunak met with his Australian counterpart in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact between the UK, US and Australia. Plans to be announced with US President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Junior doctors are staging 3 days of industrial action. The British Medical Association says staff in England have suffered a 26% real terms cut to their pay since 2008. The union says newly qualified medics earn just over £14 an hour, less than some baristas in coffee shops. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now? Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, we were just discussing with Catherine a few minutes ago the illegal migrants bill, or the so-called Stop the Boats bill. We're just now learning Conservative MP Chris Skidmore has said he will be not voting for that illegal migration bill when he attends the Commons later for the second reading. He is, of course, a backbencher who's stepping down at the next general election, but he's tweeted, "I'm not prepared to break international law or the human rights conventions that the UK has had a proud history of playing a leading role in establishing. I will not be voting for the bill tonight." So we'll keep assessing how many might vote against it. The numbers at the moment are actually in the government's favour. But Sir Keir Starmer also saying earlier, just to remind you, that this bill will not stop, as he said, the small boats crossing the channel. He said the security of our borders is paramount, but the bill is just like the last bill. It won't solve the problem. More on that, of course, as that bill progresses. But let's stay in Westminster Abbey this time, because today marking the King's first Commonwealth Day as monarch, with that task of keeping the Commonwealth united during his reign. He'll be delivering a message on the theme of forging a sustainable and peaceful common future. He'll be delivering that from the great pulpit within Westminster Abbey. And the Queen Consort, accompanied by the Prince and Princess of Wales and other senior royals, also attending. Then later the King and Queen Consort to host the Commonwealth leaders and other dignitaries, as usual, at Buckingham Palace for the annual Commonwealth Day reception. But let's join now our Cameron Walker, our royal reporter, outside the Abbey, where the ceremonies are taking place. And I think we can...
Mark, yes, the bells have started tolling here at Westminster Abbey. Hello, Mark. The Princess Royal and her husband, Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence, have arrived in the last few minutes here at Westminster Abbey. It's a very significant day because this is the first Commonwealth Day service that His Majesty the King will be in attendance at as the new head of the Commonwealth. Of course, it is a decision that was made during the 2018 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and it was the express wish of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, that her son would succeed her as head of the Commonwealth. Of course, a family of nations she was devoted to throughout her reign, but as well as very noisy bells, which I'm sure you can hear, there are very noisy protesters as well. There are two main protest groups here, the first of which is Republic, anti-monarchy protesters who do not believe in a hereditary head of state. Many people have criticised him for being here, saying the King is going to be here in his capacity as head of the Commonwealth rather than as head of state. Their argument is that the King, wherever he is a hereditary head of state, and that is what they've got a problem with. The other big protest group is the LGBT plus human rights campaigners, and they are pointing out to the fact that 22 of the 56 Commonwealth nations, according to the protesters here, have anti-LGBT plus laws, and 7 of which you can still get a maximum of life imprisonment for homosexuality. So that is why they are protesting. We are expecting in the next few minutes other members of the royal family to arrive, the King, Queen Consorts, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and of course the new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh here, Prince Edward and his wife Sophie. There's also meant to be a Commonwealth reception a bit later on at Buckingham Palace. We have a 2,000 strong congregation here, a number of government ministers. We have performances from saxophonists, West End performers as well, a number of school children from across the United Kingdom, and a number of Commonwealth Games athletes from the home nation, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are very much in attendance. So very noisy here at Westminster Abbey, but a very significant historical day, just 2 months short of another big historical day, the coronation, which will be taking place in Westminster Abbey here on the 6th of May. And according to reports, the ballroom of Buckingham Palace, where the building where this Commonwealth Day reception is taking place, has been transformed to a makeshift Westminster Abbey so they can rehearse in private ahead of the big day.
I do choose my moments to pass the microphone over to you there, Cameron, so apologies for that, for whom the bell tolls. However, I hope you can still hear me. Just to reiterate an interesting point, we were learning about the bell ringers wanting to get a bit of practice before the coronation, not just at the Abbey but across Britain, and it sounds as if they're getting a bit of a workout there behind you.
Yes, Mark, they certainly are here at Westminster Abbey, but of course the problem for a lot of churches across the country is that they don't have enough bell ringers in order to ring every single church bell in the country on the day of the coronation, which is the aim. So they're trying to encourage many people to take up the skill ahead of the coronation. But I think for big churches like Westminster Abbey, like St Paul's Cathedral, big cathedrals across the country as well, I don't think there's any short. So they're certainly very loud here today, so I'm sure they are getting their practice in ahead of the coronation. Please do interrupt me, Mark, if you see members of the royal family arriving. I can hear boos from anti-monarchy protests, which suggests to me that we are having a few more members of the royal family arriving. But so far, all I've seen is Princess Anne and Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence. Of course, Princess Anne is the head of state, the King's sister, and we're expecting senior members of the royal family here. But no Harry and Meghan, they are still in California, and of course it was 2020 during the Commonwealth Day service which they had their last official appearance as working members of the royal family, and the atmosphere perhaps could best be described as frosty on that occasion.
Yeah.
But I'm sure members of the royal family today, here in 2023, the start of the new reign, are hoping for a big success.
I think I'm safe in saying that Prince Edward and Sophie Wessex, or the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, as they are now, have arrived. And this is a significant handing over again of the generations, because to remind people, this was Prince Philip's wish that he became Duke of Edinburgh after his passing.
Yes, it was. The King bestowed the title of the Duke of Edinburgh to Prince Edward on his 59th birthday, which happened on Friday. At the time of Edward and Sophie's wedding in 1999, the Queen Elizabeth II bestowed the titles of Earl and Countess of Wessex onto them. But at the time, a statement from Buckingham Palace said, in due course, when the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, and Queen Elizabeth II are no longer with us, the titles of Duke of Edinburgh and Duchess of Edinburgh would be passed on to Edward and Sophie, and that is exactly what has happened. There was some rumours perhaps that the King would choose not to give his brother, his youngest brother, the title of Duke of Edinburgh because he wants a slimmed-down monarchy, but clearly that hasn't happened. The King has given the titles Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh to Edward and Sophie. But of course, they're given the titles, but of course, it is their son, the Viscount Severn, is now the new Earl of Wessex. It looks like other members of the royal family are just arriving, Mark.
Well, we'll stay with you. Our cameras were just picking up the Rolls-Royces as they approach. And clearly, from what you've been saying with the protests, security will be of the utmost concern. I think that's one of King Charles's favourite 1960s vintage Rolls-Royce Phantoms. He's one very much for the perhaps more established traditions of transport rather than the newer vehicles that are available. But I think that is the 1971 Phantom 5, a favourite of the late Queen Elizabeth II. How have the public reacted there at the moment, Cameron? Oh, Cameron can't hear us at the moment. He's probably deaf after the bells, but there we are. We have King Charles and the Queen Consort arriving with the dancers there once more. I don't know whether our camera mic can pick up the music. As they enter Westminster Abbey, the King, as we say, to deliver that message from the great pulpit, with some 2,000 in the congregation. The message being to forge a sustainable and peaceful common future with the Commonwealth. And of course, I think they managed to drown out the protesters, perhaps even louder than the bells there. And certainly that was a proper greeting for the King as he arrived there, Cameron.
It certainly was. There is a big, diverse group in the congregation, 2,000 strong inside Westminster Abbey. Of course, the King met with an official welcome here. As you said, the theme of this year's Commonwealth Day service is forging a sustainable and peaceful future. And during his speech in the great pulpit, he is expected to reflect on the fact that there is very much a youth-led action campaign for the Commonwealth this year, because 60% of Commonwealth citizens, Mark, are under the age of 30. And we know that King Charles, when he was Prince of Wales was very much championing this idea of a sustainable world and a sustainable future. Of course, now as head of state, he has to be very careful not to be too politically partial in terms of sustainability and environmental issues. He seems to have passed that on to his son, the Prince of Wales, with his Earthshot Prize every year. But no doubt, I think there'll be a bit of power of soft diplomacy in action here today in Westminster Abbey at the Great Pulpit when he delivers his message. As soon as we know exactly what he says, we will bring that straight to you. But it is expected to last around an hour, this Commonwealth Day service. And as soon as we have any details of what is happening inside, we will bring that straight to you, along with the Buckingham Palace reception, which is happening later on this evening for those diplomats and different heads of state which have come to London, especially for the Commonwealth Day service.
Indeed. Going to be a busy afternoon. Cameron, thank you for that. We'll let you go and rub a few noses and greeting. But for the moment, thanks very much indeed. And, of course, as Cameron says, we'll have all the latest from Westminster Abbey and then from Buckingham Palace. Now, after 2 weeks of, pretty spirited debate on Scotland's future and the SNP's future, members of the party will from today be able to vote on their preferred choice of candidate to replace Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. Well, the party members have until March the 27th to choose between the Health Secretary, Humza Yousaf, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and former Community Safety Minister Ash Regan. Let's catch up with the latest now with the political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail, Michael Blackley. Michael, thanks for joining us once more. I think I'm right in saying that the preferred candidate within the party appears to be Humza Yousaf, but in terms of the Scottish population in general, it's Kate Forbes who's ahead in the various polls.
Yes, there's been some fascinating polling in recent days that suggests with the Scottish public generally, Kate Forbes does score better on really all aspects of her performance as a potential First Minister. Humza Yousaf lagging behind in second place, but Humza Yousaf is the Health Secretary. He seems to be favoured by a lot of the SNP hierarchy. He got a major boost at the weekend when the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, backed him. So there's no question that SNP members are getting the impression from the party leadership that Humza Yousaf is their choice. So it's a question of whether do they listen to what the public wants or do they decide to go along with what the party leadership appears to want?
And how much have they been talking about independence? Because they've all been sort of dissing each other's track record on their various, the health in terms of Humza Yousaf and then finance and so on. Independence seems to have taken a bit of a back door.
Yes, it has seemed like that. Certainly when it comes to the SNP hustings, it's been a pretty dominant issue. The SNP members are always keen to raise issues relating to independence, so it's been coming up prominently at hustings. They all have very different approaches as to what they will do to pursue the case for independence. Humza Yousaf at the weekend was talking about the prospect of, he said that he would do anything, he would use any means to secure independence, and he was talking about the possibility of a snap Scottish Parliament election in order to try and encourage independence. However, some of the polling that's come out in recent days, including one that's come out just this afternoon, suggests that support for independence is declining. It's really falling off a cliff, to be honest. It's down at 39% on the poll that's out today. So whoever becomes the next leader has got a long, hard battle to try and get that support up again, because it seems to be going completely backwards from the SNP's perspective.
A big ask for anyone who gets that job. March the 27th, as we say, we'll update people as we get the results of the polling. Thank you very much indeed, or the voting as such. Now, many of you will be basking in a balmy 10 Celsius. The Met Office issuing now 3 more yellow snow and ice weather warnings and a yellow wind warning for good measure, as bitter conditions are set to return after last week's Storm Larissa. It could lead to treacherous travel conditions for the north of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and outbreaks of rain too and strong winds. That's the snow earlier, just to remind you what it looked like. So let's get more on what we've got in store with meteorologist John Hammond joining us. John, we're not out of the woods yet then, it seems.
Hello, Mark. No, it's a turbulent spell of weather, that's for sure, and will continue to be so over the next, week or two at least. The big picture actually is one of unusually high pressure across the Arctic, and that's pushing cold air out of polar latitudes towards our neck of the woods. And of course, at this time of year, you've got warmth trying to push up from the south. And that's causing a lot of volatility in the jet stream, which means we're getting cold, then warm, then cold, then warm. And along that jet stream, some very strong winds to boot. But at the moment, you mentioned 10 degrees. It's actually 15 degrees across parts of East Anglia in the southeast. Contrast that, Mark, with about 5 degrees across Scotland. And the winner of this particular battle between the warm and the cold will be the cold as we go through the next 24 hours. So the moment that dividing line is Hadrian's Wall, and to the north of that, we're back into winter. And that winter weather is going to surge southwards later on today and overnight tonight. Hence the snow and ice warnings which have been issued by the Met Office. And by first thing tomorrow morning, Mark, we'll all be back in winter and there will be some disruptive snow around.
So we'll be looking at 15 Celsius with some longing as we head backwards again. And it is meteorological spring. Of course, that happened on March the 1st. When will spring actually appear? I mean, looking forward to next week, is it going to get better?
In parts and in places, but not consistently. Just to put in context, the cold which we're going to get over the next 24 hours, it won't be anything like as cold as it was last week. Couple of reasons for that. The cold air coming down out of the Arctic isn't quite as frigid. And also, Mark, you know, we're a week or so on from last week, and it's amazing how much stronger the strength of the sun's rays is just in a few days. At this time of year, that sun's getting ever stronger. But having said all that, I think with all that high pressure across the Arctic, and it's likely to be predominantly high pressure across the Arctic, there will be a tendency still over the next few weeks for it to push cold air towards us. So I think a fairly sort of rock and roll journey into spring, if you like. It's sort of one step forward, 2 steps back, I think. And I wouldn't rule out further frost and snow in the run up to Easter. But, you know, with each week that goes past, that cold won't be quite as cold as it was before because of the strengthening snow.
And that snow, I guess, is any of these weather systems coming in from the Atlantic. It hits that cold air and suddenly it's dropping as snow instead of rain.
Got it in one. And time of day is crucial at this time of year. You know, the snow that falls overnight, first thing tomorrow morning could be pretty fraught, even across parts of southern Britain. If we get some snow showers late in the night, particularly up over the high ground, there could be some disruption. But, you know, by late morning, much of that snow on low ground will have melted. It's only really the high ground of northern Britain which is going to see that snow sticking around.
Right, let's just enjoy the 15 Celsius while we can then. John, as ever, thanks for updating us, and we look forward to spring whenever it arrives. Thank you very much indeed. That's it from us for the moment, but of course, don't forget we're back tomorrow, 12 to 3, but stay with Patrick, of course, very latest in Westminster Abbey as well as the King delivers that Commonwealth Day speech from the Great Altar. Coming up now, more weather in more detail.
Hello, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Winter bites back over the next 24 hours with colder air pushing south, wintry showers accompanying the cold air as well, but also some clear spells and some sunshine emerging by Tuesday. It's been a cloudy, mild and windy day for many on Monday. The cold air in the far north of Scotland, though, is pushing its way south as low pressure clears to the east. There is a band of rain, though, moving south across England and Wales. That will continue during Monday evening and into the early hours. Then the cold air arrives and we're seeing showers of sleet and snow affect Scotland and Northern Ireland already. They'll push into central parts of England and Wales overnight. Most of the snow accumulating above 200 metres.